Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Calvin Pierre, and I'm the president of the Black Law Student Association here at Widener Commonwealth Law. So I'd like to thank you all for coming out this morning. I wrote a few things down here that I'd like to address. So first, I would like to say, if there is no struggle, there is no progress. Right? So these are the words that motivate BALSA members to help us navigate through the waters of law school. See, law school is really difficult through the first year, so our job as an organization is to encourage first-year law students and help make this process a lot easier. See, African Americans, we are 5 times more likely to be incarcerated in this country. In fact, we only make up about 5% of the legal profession. So our job here as BALSA members, that's why this organization is so important, because we're encouraging people who look like us to pursue a prestigious career. See, most of us are the first people in our family to pursue a legal education. So coming to law school is a big deal. When we go back home to our parents, we're like the golden egg. You know, everyone is so happy to see us and want to know more about our experience. So our duty here as BALSA members is to push the agenda for change. As I mentioned, our primary target are first-year law students. So we provide mentorship programs and also host meetings to make this experience a lot more feasible, a lot more easier for people like us. We also connect with alumni because we encourage our students to grow their network, because your network is your net worth, is what we believe. So all while doing so, we push the agenda for inclusion, because these problems that we face within our communities cannot only be solved by us, but can be solved by all of us, people from diverse backgrounds. That is the best way to solve problems. So with that in mind, if we all have a common cause and we push towards that, we can make this country a better place and also spark the minds of the next generation to do the same. So as we all come together today in this diversity forum, I just encourage you all to just remember these things and continue to support Widener Commonwealth Law with their endeavors. So thank you very much.
Hey guys, I'm Ricky Marcel. I'm the treasurer of the Asian Pacific American Law Students Association. PALSA is really just here to provide social, academic, professional support for Asian American students and Asian Pacific students. We're a new group. We haven't really done that much yet, but we have had a couple cool events so far, and we've gotten a lot of support. So in the fall, we did a potluck. We had a lot of people come out and provide, everybody brought different dishes from different Asian cultures. We had, Japanese food, Korean food, Indian food, and it was just a really cool event where everybody was able to come together and, share a little bit about, those different cultures and their different backgrounds. And then more recently, we did a sort of Chinese New Year celebration where, it's traditional during Chinese New Year when you give sort of money to people in these red envelopes. And so, of course, we didn't want to just give out money because we didn't have it, but we were able to give people like different kind of unique fortunes, and we had a lot of prizes. And, it was just a really cool event where we had a lot of, student engagement, and we were able to kind of raise the profile of APALSA and of Asian American students and Asian Pacific students at school. Going forward, what we really want to do is sort of provide, we want to continue to do these kind of social events, but we're also hoping to engage in some kind of professional development events. We really hope to have, for instance, like Asian American or Asian Pacific lawyers come in and talk about their experiences and the unique challenges facing Asian Americans in the legal profession. So yeah, thanks a lot. If you guys are students, come out, check out an event when you get a chance. Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
everyone. My name is Jennifer Boulevard. I'm president and founder of the Latin American Law Student Association here at Widener Law Commonwealth. I started the organization because I wanted to promote diversity. I am a first-generation Colombian American, and firsthand, I've been able to deal with a lot of obstacles because I was the first one in my family to go to college, go to high school, come to law school, and graduate without really having someone to guide me and help me. My first language is Spanish. I dealt with a lot of issues, so I wanted Latin Americans here to basically have somewhere that they could go to if they ever felt like they were being excluded, if they ever needed guidance, if they needed somewhere to go because they felt left out. And with that, I also wanted to promote diversity within campus because for years we've had BALSA, but we've never really had any other organizations on campus. And after LAWSA was created, APALSA became a thing. So hopefully it allows other people to feel like more organizations need to come on campus. It allows other people to feel like they belong. So far this semester, we've had a potluck where we've raised money and fundraised. We had people from different backgrounds bring in food, and that money was given to Puerto Rico for disaster relief. And it allowed people in school that weren't Puerto Rican, that weren't from a Latin culture, to understand what was going on in Puerto Rico and the issues that they're currently facing. We are also going to be working on having an immigration panel come next year because it's such a hot topic within the Hispanic community. And there's a lot of interest for immigration here at the school. And in April, we're thinking of having almost like a Latin night so that people can see what it's like to, I guess, hang out with, I guess you could say hang out with Latin Americans, listen to the music and stuff like that. And aside from just having Latin Americans, I guess you could say, come together, we are also working with BALSA and APALSA for many things. So when they have events, we try to go, and in that sense, we're also helping them promote diversity within the school, and we're also helping other people feel welcomed. So, yeah. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. My name is Salvatore Sciacca. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Widener Commonwealth Law Review, and I'm the president of the Veterans Association here on campus. Days like this, I think, are really wonderful. I was just talking earlier with Calvin. So when you say diversity, if there's no meaning behind it, I'm not exactly sure what we're talking about. Widener doesn't go that route at all. There is true inclusion here for just about everybody that I've met. I've not seen the person who said, I feel excluded from anything. And that's something that as a veteran I take very seriously. Widener Commonwealth Law Review has been tirelessly editing articles and checking Blue Book citations. We actually are publishing our first diversity comment in this upcoming edition for the spring. And about a month from now, on March 27th, we'll have our symposium. So watch out for that. That should be a great time. Veterans Association, recently we were involved in the homeless veterans stand down at the 20th Infantry Division headquarters. And I think in 2 weeks, there's the Wheels for Heroes event as well. So if you have any interest, please come out, support the local veteran population as well. Without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Dean Johnson. He's the Dean of the Law School. He's been here for 5 years, and thanks so much for hosting this event.
This is terrific to see all of you here at our 13th annual Dean's Diversity Forum. I'm honored that it's named in the name of the Dean, but the real brains and efforts behind this goes to Professor Randy Lee. He's been tirelessly creative over, Randy, have you been responsible for all 13 Dean's Diversity Forums? 12 of them. And every year is always something unique and interesting, and please join me in giving Randy a vote of thanks. It's terrific to see our students up here, and again, I think that's important to have them front and center right now in this particular activity. Our 1L class this year self-identified as 30% persons of color, which is just extraordinary, especially viewing some of the demographics we have in central Pennsylvania. We had a meeting about implicit bias for our 1L class, and I was looking at our students, and it really occurred to me that with respect to this incoming generation, they are diverse, and they are bringing unique viewpoints and concepts and other kinds of things that we need both here at law school and also in society in general. I think it's my generation that's playing catch up as we're working on this and dealing with these particular issues. And so it's just delightful to see the good work that they're doing, and I'm glad they had a chance to share with you the wonderful things that are going on at the student level, and today you'll enjoy the program that we put together by the law school on that. I'll go ahead and thank the students, and they can go ahead and take their seats in the audience as we get ready for our next panel. Our panel, the first panel is entitled The Harlem Renaissance and the Civil Rights Movement. And we're thrilled with our speakers today. We have the Honorable Nathaniel C Nichols, who graduated from Howard University in 1970 and from the Columbia University School of Law in 1973. His legal career started in 1974 at the Delaware County Legal Assistance Association, where he became the managing attorney. He then went into private practice with the firm of Early, Nichols, and Givens. Later, Judge Nichols formed the firm of Nichols and Givens. Now, most importantly, in 1986, he joined the faculty of Widener Law School as a clinical professor. As a clinical professor, Judge Nichols supervised law students who represented low-income clients before the Delaware County Court of Common Pleas. He also served as Dean of Students and the Director of Clinical Programs while at Widener. Over his academic career, he wrote several law review articles and taught creditors' rights, consumer bankruptcy, domestic violence, and property. In 2011, Judge Nichols was elected as a judge on the Court of Common Pleas of Delaware County. During his time as a judge, Judge Nichols served on the Juvenile Court Judges Commission. He retired from the position in January of 2019. And as I can see, I'm not sure, Judge, that you've retired from making a difference in society, though. We appreciate you coming here. He's a member of the American, Pennsylvania, and Delaware County Bar Associations. Judge Nichols was named Child Advocate of the Year by the Pennsylvania Bar Association in March of 2018. So, welcome, Judge. Professor Randall Westbrook is a professor at the School of Education at Farley Dickinson University in Madison, New Jersey, and an internationally recognized authority on the lives of W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson. Randall was a featured historian on the award-winning PBS documentary American Master Series, Paul Robeson, Here I Stand, and has served as a featured and keynote speaker at national birthday celebrations for Du Bois. Randall is also a founding member of the Paul Robeson Institute for Ethics, Leadership, and Social Justice. Randall has made more than 200 presentations in churches, libraries, and corporations on topics including not only Du Bois and Robeson, but also on the life and legacy of Abraham Lincoln, the Harlem Renaissance, slavery, diversity, and preparing for college. He's been interviewed by regional and national publications, and his work can be found in journals like the Journal for African American History and the Lincoln Journal for Social and Political Thought. Westbrook has a technical advisor and principal researcher on documentary about slavery in New Jersey. A longtime resident of New Jersey, Randall is an honors graduate of Livingston College in Salisbury, North Carolina, where he was cited for his scholarship and leadership on the local, state, and national levels, including special recognition by President Ronald Reagan, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Westbrook also holds master's and doctoral degrees from Rutgers University. Please join me in welcoming Judge Nichols and Professor Westbrook. And importantly, Professor Randy Lee will be the moderator for this panel.
I am very excited to be here, and I will turn this over to the people that actually have something to say. But before I do, I have to just share a quote that Judge Nichols shared with me when I first started this kind of planning this program. And it really, I think, for me, had a transformative effect on the way that we see all of these, or the way that I see all of these diversity programs. And the thing that Judge Nichols said to me, he said, ideas are not engaging. People need to be engaged by ideas. And to go back and pick a topic like the Harlem Renaissance, and I was thinking of the topic when Dean Johnson was saying that he was feeling his generation was a little behind, and I thought, wow, to start catching up, I have to go back to an event that was 100 years ago. That's how far behind I am. But I really in a way think that's not being behind. That the idea behind this program to go back and look at the Harlem Renaissance, or to go back, as Randall has dedicated his career to, and to look at the works of W.E.B. Du Bois, for example, is not to look at those ideas kind of like you were going to a museum or a gallery and say, oh, isn't that cute? Isn't that engaging? Isn't that attractive? Isn't that pretty? But to encounter those ideas and use that encounter to rediscover who we are and who we can become. And I think that's really the point of what we're trying to do today, or hopefully what we're trying to do today, is to re-encounter questions, re-encounter ideas, and reevaluate who we are and who we want to become. So, Randall, if you could get us started in that adventure.
Sure.
You can use the podium, or wherever you are comfortable. Make yourself at home.
Well, sometimes I walk, but I know that I don't want to throw people's eyes off, so I'll just sort of pull back just a little bit, and I'll look around the room as I speak. So I just ask you to indulge me and forgive my seat. I might stand up. But as we think about this and this 100th anniversary of the Harlem Renaissance, as was stated, my academic life's work has been on the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, and my particular focus about Du Bois is actually work that was prior to the Harlem Renaissance. But I continue on, and part of the reason that I do that is because I don't think that enough focus was put on how he developed himself. You know what, I'm going to stand. Is this a mic? What's this?
I think Brian has told me that you are mic'd wherever you are.
Oh, that's wonderful. Because I'm sorry. I'm sitting and I'm looking and I'm saying, oh. and sometimes what happens is when I sit, I don't know what happens, but at any rate, one of the things that I think about when we're talking about Du Bois is just the magnitude of his life. And I was reading something to one of my classes, and I started laughing in the middle, and they said, what? And I said, I keep writing this same sentence. In a career that spanned 80 years, just stop to think about that for a moment. A career as a public intellectual that lasted 80 years. And when we say 80, it was 80 full years. And in the middle of it was the Harlem Renaissance. If we think about Du Bois's life, we think about how all-encompassing his life was relative to the issue of civil rights. Okay? The first thing that he wrote as a public intellectual was in 1883. The last thing he wrote as a public intellectual was in 1963. So we say 80 years, it was a real 80 years. And what was the first thing he wrote? He was a local correspondent for the Springfield Republican, I believe the newspaper was. And what he talked about in this article was a hayride and a church gathering and an upcoming election. The following piece that he wrote 2 weeks later was encouraging black men to develop greater literacy skills so that they would be better, more engaged voters. Okay. How old was Du Bois when he wrote this? He was 15. 6 years before he would have been able to vote in a country where 90+% of people who looked like him could not vote. And he was encouraging African American men to vote. And he said, I think it would be a good idea if we develop our skills, our literacy, so that we can become more engaged in the process. I believe that if we fully exercise our rights, the Negro will be a force that cannot be despised. 15 years old. A few years later, when he gets to Fisk University in Tennessee, he tells us in his autobiographical writings that one of the first people that he met was Lena Horne's aunt. Lena Horne, one of the most famous African-American actresses right at the end of the Harlem Renaissance, considered to be one of the most beautiful women in the world, and Du Bois was not shy about saying she was nice looking, but her aunt, my goodness. One of the second people, among the second group of people that he met was Margaret Murray. Maggie ended up becoming Booker T. Washington's third wife. Now, Du Bois was young, he was small for his size, and I always laugh because I have a sort of personal, I have such a personal affinity for Du Bois that I talk about things and people sort of say, you talk as if you know him. And I said, I feel like I do. I've been with him for 40 years. A historian, a groundbreaking sociologist, that when he did the Philadelphia Negro, the first study of urban life among African Americans, and one of the first urban sociological studies ever conducted in the United States. He was so precise that he interviewed 95% of all of the people, and he had a research assistant who did the other 5. And I laugh about that 5 that she was allowed to do, the fact that he allowed someone to do it. But again, note the use of the word she was allowed to do. Du Bois always had women at his right hand, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. So precise about his sociological investigations, but he never showed accuracy describing his height. And I understand that. When you're height challenged, you tend to not be accurate about your height. Just like I talk about wind blowing through my hair sometimes and in a rather wistful way. When he was at Fisk, he wrote a letter called An Open Letter to the Southern People. And one of the things that he said in the letter that I thought was particularly interesting, and he wrote this when he was just about to turn 18, said that for 25 years since emancipation, we have existed as separate parties by your hand, by your urging. So forgive us if we are a bit skeptical about the fact that now, all of a sudden, you want to talk to us. The Negro has come to realize that anything that is said to be for their good, expressed by white people, bracketed in the South, is probably for their detriment. And the reason that he said that was because all of a sudden, you could be lynched for doffing your cap, for making direct eye contact, for not moving off the sidewalk. But now all of a sudden, you want to invite us into your sitting rooms because you have a bill that needs to be voted upon, and you have come to the realization that there might be so much opposition that you actually need my support. And I can imagine, as he was writing this letter, that he's thinking to himself, the election is over, and we go back to being ostracized. Ostracized if we're lucky. Murdered just for existing. And you wonder why we're skeptical. So this was an argument that he made at 18. He got to Harvard after he graduated from Fisk. And when he got to Harvard, finished a bachelor's degree and was working on his master's degree and was nearly finished. And he reads something from Rutherford B. Hayes that said, I wish there were Negroes who were intelligent enough to accept an offer for study in Europe. And Du Bois, being known at the age of, he was 22 at that time. Most of his friends already were calling him Du Bois. Very few people called him Will. I think Maggie Murray called him Will. His wife called him Will. Most everybody else called him Doctor, or they called him Du Bois. And I think by the time he was 34 or 5, they started calling him the Old Man, and that title stuck for 61 years. Have you seen this article that Rutherford B. Hayes, what he said? So Du Bois started to recruit African Americans to apply for this fellowship. And then he applied for it himself. Now, by the time he applied for it, he had a bachelor's from Fisk, he had a bachelor's from Harvard, he was about to complete his master's at Harvard. They asked for 3 references, he sent 8. He didn't just send any references. He sent 3 references from the Harvard faculty and 5 college presidents. He was turned down. And he wrote a letter to Rutherford B. Hayes. It was as I expected. You went before the country and decried the intellectual potency of Negro students. And when you finally get applicants who are qualified, the offer is suddenly withdrawn. I think you owe the Negro people an apology. I can find money for myself, but I think you owe the Negro people an apology. 23 years old, and he is dressing down a former president of the United States. It takes audacity. But he was not an ordinary person. He was an audacious person almost by disposition. I like going back to his youth. The first time he left home, he went to visit his grandfather, who was friends with Frederick Douglass. And he wrote a letter to his mom, and he said, in the train station there was a log book, like one of those books that you sign when you go to a wedding. All the most prominent people who have ever been to this town have signed this book. So of course, I added my illustrious name. And you know, when you read that in a vacuum, you think about it again. This was a precocious kid, but no, he wasn't a precocious kid. He was firmly fixed on a mission. I say all of that as an introduction and as a pretext to the Harlem Renaissance. I give Du Bois credit for almost anything, and actually in my exact written statement, I start off with these words. I just wanted to quote myself, if you don't mind. It could be fairly stated that nearly every significant occurrence that directly impacted the lives of Black people in the United States during the last decade of the 19th and much of the 20th century, W.E.B. Du Bois could be found at the epicenter. How did Du Bois end up starting the Harlem Renaissance? In his chair as editor of Crisis Magazine, founding editor of Crisis Magazine, he hired Jessie Redmond Fawcett, a Black woman educated at Bryn Mawr. She was also a novelist. He hired her as an editor on the staff. And he gave her free rein to be able to recruit and discover and bring in artists. The first cover of the Crisis magazine actually was drawn by Du Bois. He actually did his own covers. So yeah, he fancied himself. He was a polymath, but he acted completely as such. Jessie Fawcett recruited Langston Hughes and Jean Toomer. She encouraged Claude McKay and County Cullen. And here's the funny thing about how that happened. Du Bois started featuring different artists, okay? And those four names, along with Jessie, along with Georgia Douglas Johnson, became the first people who were famous in the Harlem Renaissance. He was friends, actually, he was a mentor to Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson was born around the same time as Du Bois' son, who died at 2 years old. So all of these people that we hear, that we talk about, these brightest stars in this galaxy, Du Bois had a direct connection with them and started publishing their work. He did a special edition about Negro artists, and 2 months later, the Urban League, which he was sort of a philosophical founder, okay, he was a sociologist, and they hired all sociologists to run their magazine, all of his former students. So again, I'm giving him credit for founding the National Urban League as well as the NAACP. I was watching the documentary Baseball, and they mentioned him on that documentary too. I said, man, that's just giving me more stuff. You gotta stop. You gotta stop. Two months after Du Bois' special edition on African American artists, the National Urban League changed the focus of their magazine, Opportunity, to feature African American artists. In 1924 at Cafe Society, Charles Spurgeon Johnson, who was the director of research, he was Du Bois' counterpart at the NAACP, had a party that was supposed to honor Jessie Fawcett. Jessie Fawcett was sort of the co-host. That was, in effect, the coming out party for the Harlem Renaissance. "4 years after the Centennial, right? What were the social forces that started the Harlem Renaissance, is what we talk about. Well, it was split between two presidents. We had one president who was, although a statesman, was an inveterate racist who encouraged Klan activity. When Birth of a Nation came out, he called it one of the greatest movies he's ever seen, one of the greatest achievements in art that he'd ever seen. Something that sounded something like, not all Klansmen are bad people. There are some good ones. Indeed. By the time the Harlem Renaissance got rolling, there was a president that was so engrossed in scandal that if you shook his hand and shook it again, you could probably, when you withdrew your hand, it might be full with money, your hand or his. He was so engrossed in scandal that he has been labeled the most scandal-ridden president in the history of the Republic. This was the ground upon which the Harlem Renaissance was started. Black men and women were being lynched, coming home from war, being lynched in their uniforms. And the images seared into our conscience from the pages of the crisis and from the pages of opportunity. Something needed to be done to elevate the appreciation for peoples of African descent. Du Bois believed that one of the ways was art, but that was not a new thing for him. This notion of appreciating culture through art. It makes sense. We feed the heart through the eyes and through the ears, but also, I would argue, through the stomach, right? When we, isn't, Anthony Bourdain and folks like that who traveled around the world getting people to appreciate different cultures from food, right? But this was a long-held belief by Du Bois. This was not a new thing. As David Levering Lewis calls it, civil rights by copyright. So, how long was this held by Du Bois? First thing he wrote, he talked about social engagement. Hay rides, church socials. He was a member of the quilting bee. He was the only male member of his town's quilting bee in the AME Zion Church in Great Barrington. He understood that through artistic endeavor, we develop greater appreciations for each other. And people who might be inclined to leave us as a force that might be despised, might be otherwise engaged, might be otherwise influenced. So he talked about this from the age of 15. Quilting bees, sewing circles, hay rides. He even led debates. One of the first debates that he talked about that was at his church, and he invited people. Ought the Indian be civilized? Mr. Du Bois will speak in the affirmative. Now, I got to tell you, people did not know that Du Bois was only 15 years old. They didn't know he was 15. They would read this article in the Springfield newspaper or in the New York Age. Sometimes it might get farmed out to the Baltimore African American or to other black papers. Every 2 weeks you're reading these articles, and at the bottom of the article you see 4 letters, WEBD. They did not know that the writer was a 5'4"-ish 15-year-old kid. They did not know that Great Barrington's community probably had less than 40 black adult citizens. That's approximately how many they have now. People always say to me, how do you know? Because I was sitting at a table once talking to 5 or 6 black residents, and they literally figured it out. Named all of them. 150 years after Du Bois, after Du Bois's birth, the number of black people in Great Barrington did not change. I don't think that they all, I'm guessing they all didn't live to be counted again, but yeah, it was about 40 people. But if you're reading these articles every 2 weeks, you're thinking to yourself, wow, this place, Great Barrington, must be some kind of place for colored folks. But it's too hard to get to. It's 30 miles away from Albany, New York, on the opposite side of Boston. It's hard to get to. Last time I was in Great Barrington, it was snowing, and I put on my little thing on my phone, and it said 25 minutes. 2.5 hours later, as I pull up to the bridge and look out at the mighty Housatonic, where I made it. Tiny town, minuscule African-American community, but Du Bois made it seem like a bustling metropolis. He made it seem like Harlem at the height of the Renaissance. The power of words, the power of an idea, the power of empowerment. 15 years old, he started this revolutionary thought. He got a hold of it, but more importantly, it got a hold of him. He understood its importance. Everywhere he went, he looked to see artistic endeavor about how people enrich themselves. When he went to Germany to study, oh, by the way, I left that out. After he told Rutherford B. Hayes, I think you owe the Negro people an apology, a few months later, Rutherford B. Hayes wrote to the administrator of the scholarship and said, this fellow seems to be a man of substance. I think we should give him another review. And he got the scholarship. Good news, bad news, he got the scholarship. He made it all the way up until he was ready for his 1-semester residency, after which he would have defended his dissertation, written entirely in German, by the way. He would have come home as one of the most credentialed scholars in the United States, white or black. But they turned him down to be able to finish his residency, so he had to come home. Poor thing, he had to settle for his safety school to earn his PhD, which he did a couple years later when he became the first African American to complete his PhD at Harvard University. Think about that. I say that to my students sometimes. I say, can you imagine this? Harvard was your safety school. Harvard was your fallback. So he finished this degree, but while he was at Harvard, he would give concerts, he would give full shows. Boys was nothing if not dramatic about things, artistic about things. We don't associate Du Bois with artistic endeavors. But all the while that he was in Boston, he would put on plays with William Monroe Trotter and Deanie Trotter, who he was almost engaged to Deanie, and I guess they decided they would go their separate ways, and so she ended up a couple years later marrying William Monroe Trotter, who was the founding publisher of The Guardian in Boston. They would put on plays, they would put on concerts, they would do readings, dramatic readings. And the reason that he did this was because he wanted to elevate the humanity. He wanted to give people a sense of ethnic pride. He wanted to give them a sense of empowerment through the creative written word. That was 30 years before the Harlem Renaissance. 40 years before the Harlem Renaissance, he was walking around Fisk and he was doing concerts, the Jubilee Singers, but he was sort of like an opening act, he and his friends. So his whole life, and he talks about what is beauty. Beauty is truth. So in 1926, how much more time do I have? I think, Professor Lee, how much?
5, 10 minutes?
Okay, good. That's good. I just want to make sure. So last time I asked that, I was at a program and the person said, I said, how much more time do I have? And they said, well, you had. So in 1926, Du Bois gives a speech, and I'm a fan. I guess I should admit that now. Du Bois gives a speech called, and he titles it Criteria of Negro Art. And he says, you know, what does this organization that has to do with the civil rights of the Negro people have to do with art? And what has art to do with it? Some might say nothing. And then he goes and gives this vigorous defense about what art does for people. He talked about what art does for people, folk art, how it gets adapted into larger pieces all throughout Europe. He talks about how artistic expression touches people's hearts in ways that bind them together, in ways that nothing else can. I should tell you that that speech that he gave in 1926, it wasn't supposed to be a speech. He was actually supposed to be introducing Carter Woodson, the founder of Black History, of Negro History Week, which evolved into Black History Month. He was introducing him as the winner of the NAACP's Spingarn Medal, but never allowed Du Bois to speak and think that it's going to be brief. He mentioned Carter Woodson's name in the middle. And he parenthetically said, who is our honoree tonight? So he said, Carter Woodson, who is our honoree tonight? It was a 20-minute speech. But it was an introduction for Carter Woodson. 10 minutes in, Carter Woodson, 10 minutes out. I've looked for the transcript. He said thank you and sat down, and someone else stood up and said, and now will Dr. Carter Woodson come up and be presented with the Spingarn Medal. Now, they weren't friends. They were friendly adversaries. Not like he and Booker T. Washington, which, for the shameless plug, title of my next book, he and Booker T. Washington, Bitter Allies. He and Carter Woodson, they agreed on a lot of stuff, but the stuff that they didn't agree on was, oof. But in this, he talked about, look at this novel, There is Confusion by Jessie Fawcett. Look at this poem by County Cullen, Yet Do I Marvel. Look at these words written by Langston Hughes. Look at these words by Georgia Douglas Johnson. Listen to these songs by Roland Hayes and Paul Robeson. Look at this art. Look at these sculptures. How can you look at these and not feel a sense of absolute pride in your race that is less than 7 decades removed from the horrors of chattel slavery? Look at this art from your people who, even as we speak, are being lynched in the streets simply for existing.
look at this art and defy anyone to tell you that you can't. What can I do? He asked rhetorically. What can't I do? No, I'm not the exception, said he. You're not the exception, said he. We are not the exception. But through artistic expression, we have the ability, we have the desire, we have the possibility, we have the reality to be exceptional. So, what are we going to do with this art? My final thought. What are we going to do with this art? We're going to use this art as a springboard, as a starting point. The fact that we, as citizens of this country, have to demand civil rights, rights that should be accorded any person who is a part of a republic. The absurdity that we have to make a request, the absurdity that we have to engage in a fight, bemoans the sad legacy of our republic. The wages of your deceit is our mistrust. But we will fight. You wouldn't allow us to fight in World War I, but when we fought, we won medals and we saved lives. You wouldn't allow us to fight for our own freedom, and you labeled us cowards. But now we're engaged in a fight, in a new fight. We will return fighting. We will return. We are here, and we shall triumph. And this was his legacy. And through this legacy, through this fight, we will prove ourselves worthy. So when I think about the Harlem Renaissance and David Levering Lewis's phrase, civil rights by copyright, the battle is waged, and it yet wages on. But we return fighting, and we will return victorious. Thank you very much.
I'm going to say nice things about you for a second. So thank you, Randall. And there's actually, you did a wonderful job of transitioning to Judge Nichols. Because one of the concepts that you latched onto from the life of W.E.B. Du Bois, question, how do we empower people to pursue, to thrive in empowerment? Right? Not just how do we empower people, period, but how do we empower people to pursue, to thrive in empowerment? And I think in Judge Nichols' career, it's easy to point out, 2018, you received the PBA Child Advocate of the Year Award. So you have, juveniles coming before you. And you look at these people and you go, okay, as a lawyer, I'm going to use my talents, my abilities to empower people to thrive in empowerment, to open the doors for them. But for me, the interesting thing is that process in your life did not just start as a judge. I mean, no offense to PBA, but they're kind of sort of late in making the observation. I actually take sort of a coming out party for you, and I don't know how many years this was, but the Association of American Law Schools did a panel several years ago, or a number of years ago at their national convention, and they invited law professors to talk about what it meant to be a mentor to law students. So not just to use your role as a lawyer to mentor non-lawyers or to help people who've encountered the system, but how do you empower people who will be lawyers to use their law degree to empower others? And of all the law professors in the United States, of the 4 or 5 people that they picked to serve on that panel to educate law professors on how to be mentors in the law school, one of the people that they selected to speak at that panel was Judge Nichols. So you had the dean of students at Harvard Law School, and then sitting next to them, you had, Judge Nichols. Interestingly enough, Professor Kearney was on that panel as well, so the final score was Widener 2, Harvard 1. But I am sitting next to a man who not only has dedicated his own career to using his law degree to empower others, but has used his law degree to empower other people to embrace a career in the law to empower others. So Judge Nichols, I will not stand between them and you any longer, but I did want to insert that observation.
All right, thank you. So, thanks to Widener, a number of years ago, my wife and I had the opportunity to go to Kenya and teach in the international program, and we took our sons there, Ken and Steve. They're about 4 years apart. And so we didn't want to do the normal touristy thing, go on this trip sponsored by AAA Travel. We've tried to find somebody from the community, so we found a cab driver named Michael, who took us around to different places in Kenya and in Nairobi, and it was wonderful. We got to know him very well. And one day we were traveling in his cab, and he just, out of the clear blue, said, "I'm very proud of you." And Cheryl and I looked at each other and we said, "Proud of us? Why?" He said, "Because you come from good stock." What does that mean? And I had to think about that for a while. And I realized, wait a minute, my ancestors were brought to this country in the belly of a ship, and they had to lay down in chains for most of the trip, and they were only taken up on the deck in sunshine to be force-fed. And if you didn't open your mouth, they had an instrument that would smack your teeth down your throat and still give you the gruel that they wanted. So he was saying that, in fact, we should be proud of what we had gone through and the fact that our ancestors had been able to survive slavery and to survive discrimination and produce us. And so that was wonderful. So now fast forward, and this comes to the Renaissance, just happened to run across this book by Zahra Neale Hurston, one of the stars of the Harlem Renaissance, and it's called The Last Barracoon. And barracoon is a kind of a Spanish word which means barracks or enclosure. And so she had an opportunity in 1924 to interview one of the last people brought to this country as a slave. It was an amazing thing to read. And it's a difficult read when you read what he says, but she didn't try to sugarcoat it. She wrote exactly what he said, exactly how he said it. And it was amazing for me to read and realize that this man had gone through what he'd gone through. And don't get it twisted, life in Africa for his nation, his people, his land, was not all milk and honey. There were fights and people were enslaved by other tribes, etc. But it's a wonderful book to read. As I said, not easy to read, to be able to get that. So, last year, in honor of Black History Month, my wife and I had a chance to go to a local church, and we heard from Brent Staples. Who's he? A Widener undergrad. Brent Staples is now on the editorial board of the New York Times. And so he gave a speech about, Black history and also about civil rights, and he schooled me, so to speak, on a couple of things. He said, you know the term Black Panther, and, grew up in the 60s. Yeah, Black Panther, the Black Beret, Black Power, the whole thing, a weapon on my shoulder. He said, Black Panther came from the South because when they were trying to get African Americans who could not read to know who to vote for when they went into the voting booth, They said, let's give him an animal. They gave them the image of a Black Panther. And on the other side, the whites there had the white chicken. So the Black Panther, while it was radicalized from the 60s, really came from the struggle for Black people to have and exercise the right to vote, even though they could not read. Even though they could not read. So he finished his speech, and then he told a very chilling story. He grew up in the South, and he used to visit his grandparents down south, and at that time, segregation was obviously quite rampant. And he remembers being in the back of his car, of his grandfather's car, in the back seat, grandmother in the front seat with grandfather, and they were driving somewhere, and all of a sudden, no, grandmother was in the back seat with him, and all of a sudden he heard his grandfather say, let's say her name was Margaret, Margaret, cover the boy's eyes. They were going past an African American who had been lynched, and he did not want his grandson to be able to see that. That struck me as a very powerful image, and for him to go from that to the point where he was on the editorial board of the New York Times, I think was absolutely, absolutely wonderful. Now, let me give some credit to my alma mater. I went to Howard undergrad, and while there was a dean, Frank Snowden, who wrote a book called Blacks in Antiquity. Blacks in Antiquity. A very interesting book, and what he did was a very detailed study. He went to Harvard undergrad and got his PhD at Harvard. He did a very detailed study of the art of antiquity that included Blacks. And so the book is filled with, statutes, et cetera, et cetera. And what he found was the Romans, who were, the big dog in those days, the Romans didn't portray Blacks in any of their statutes or their artwork as inferior. They were equal. The Romans called them Ethiopians. And there was no effort on the part of the Romans to in any way denigrate those people there. Now, part of it may be because the Ethiopians were probably pretty strong even when the Romans came in, but they didn't do that. They didn't denigrate them at all. All right, so now it's time for everybody to participate. Everybody ready? Okay. So, in Chester, Pennsylvania, which is where Widener, the university, is located, there was a courthouse, the 1724 Colonial Courthouse. And in that courthouse, there were trials of enslaved Africans. The local bar association had them restored, and they're an amazing thing to see. So let me just ask you to tell me what the court decided for Negro slave Phoebe, who was charged with stealing gold buttons from her slave owner's house. All right, everybody who thinks she was given 30 lashes, raise your hand. Some type of physical punishment? Anybody who thinks she was incarcerated or kept enslaved in a special place for a period of time, raise your hand. Okay? Anybody think she was executed? Raise your hand. Absolutely correct. For stealing gold buttons, she was hung. All right, so now let's go to the next one. And this is a trick question, so you know. Negro slave Dick, he was charged with some type of sexual assault on a white woman. I don't believe it was rape because the term was not used, but it was obviously some type of sexual assault. How many people think he got a certain sentence? How many people think he was hung? That's my gotcha. He wasn't. And here's why. He was owned by a mulatto woman. I was absolutely shocked. He was owned by a mulatto woman. So what that told me was that obviously the slave owner had had a child by a slave, one of his slaves, and that child was a mulatto. I don't know what she might have looked like, but obviously she was treated differently. So his sentence was to have an R branded on his forehead, be given 40 lashes, and be mandatorily excluded from the colony. He was sent somewhere down south. So all of these are in a book called In the Matter of Color, written by the late A. Leon Higginbotham, Jr., Third Circuit Court of Appeals judge. fascinating read. I wish we could do more to have the records given national attention, like the African American Museum. They've been restored, and they're now in the custody of the Delaware County Bar Association. So, diversity. Place looks pretty diverse to me. Look around. Look around. How diverse are we? Are we diverse in terms of gender? Are we diverse in terms of sexual orientation? Are we diverse in terms of our background? Are we diverse in terms of our education? Are we diverse in terms of how we learn? I think that's the new diversity, at least for me. My wife, having taught for all those years, had to deal with children who were diverse, who thought a different way and had to be taught a different way. And I think we need to think of diversity in a lot of contexts. And the more we think about that diversity, the more we include everybody, the more we have people who are willing to say, you know, I'd like to stand up and say, I think this because of that. So diversity is something we have to continue to work on as much as we can. That's my story. I'm sticking to it. Thank you.
Well, we have some time for questions, and as moderator, I'm asserting myself to ask questions. And I actually want to begin by asking all of you a question. And the reason to kind of follow up on what Judge Nichols was doing, but for those of you who are here for CLE credit, have you ever done the online CLE credit? Okay, so you know that when you do it online, every so often, they run the little thing and you got to hit the button on the computer, right? A lot of people don't know this, but the reality is that's hooked into 911. They want to know if you've like OD'd on CLE. We lost one, somebody died. Okay, too much CLE. So same dynamic, right? If you don't hit the button, you don't get the credit. If you don't play the game, you don't get the credit. But as I look at the Harlem Renaissance, and again, it goes back to that notion that Judge Nichols, and I'm going to stop calling him Judge Nichols because it just drives me crazy.
Me too.
And he's very gracious about it. He said, Randy, don't, and I said, I got to, but no, I'm not. So anyway, when Nick and I were talking about this, and he said, ideas need to engage people, right? It's not just, isn't that a cute idea? Isn't that an engaging idea? And two of the ideas that I've kind of found as I go through the Harlem Renaissance that I think are provocative still today, except we don't think about them, and I think we need to be engaged by them. In the Harlem Renaissance, they talked about what does integration look like? What does integration look like? And how is excellence pursued? Right? What does integration look like and how is excellence pursued? And these two questions come together because Brian has entrusted me with the opportunity to see if I can actually pull up my own PowerPoint. Right? He's in their back right now laughing. And so I want you to look at this slide. And I'm going to ask the question twice, and hopefully the first time you guys will say, that's a really stupid question. But I'm going to ask it anyway. Anybody recognize the two people on the slide? Joe DiMaggio and Ted Williams. Very good. This is the accelerated section. Thank you very much. Right? Some of you may not have recognized it as Joe DiMaggio. You may have recognized it as Mr. Coffee. Could either of these players, here's the question, could either of these players have integrated big league baseball? And the obvious answer is, Randy, that's a stupid question, right? There you go, right? So that's an even better answer than mine. My answer was, of course not, right? Because neither of them is black, right? The Hispanic, though, could have, but here's my second question. How could these two players, forget you can't, how could they have integrated big league baseball? Notice I did not say what? I did not say Major League Baseball, American League, National League. I said, how could they have integrated big league baseball? Think about it how could they? They could have played in the Negro Leagues. Why not? Right? Why not say that we have a superior product, right? We have a superior product in the Negro Leagues. They're playing better baseball. And so what we will do is we will embrace that superior product and we will integrate that into American culture. What is integration? Right? What is integration? And I think the danger, if you think of Grutter Gratz, the University of Michigan Law School, the University of Michigan undergrad case, I think there is a danger, and this goes back, Randall, to something that you said, that W.E.B. Du Bois set out to spur an appreciation of the African American, of African American culture, right? And we think of integration of baseball as opening the door to African Americans or people of color to enter into a quote unquote superior, the culture that is superior or that is dominant. And the Harlem Renaissance opened up a whole different picture of integration. The picture of integration in the Harlem Renaissance was that there is genius in the African American culture that the American culture as a whole needs to embrace, right? So the question is, I think, how do we today see integration? Do we still have a vision that this is something that we need to think broadly about? What does the American culture ultimately look like? And again, so what happens in the clips? What happens in the clip? What does integration mean in the clip? At what point, right? So anybody know the movie? Mm-hmm. Right? So what happens in the movie? Well, that is true. It shows you where your focus is, right? But we have the City of Richmond football team, right, high school, and it's integrated. And what does that mean? What does it mean for the football team to be integrated? Means black people can play with white people. What does it mean in the clip? Why is the other team freaking out? Why are the African American fans cheering and the Caucasian fans confused? How are they warming up? They're warming up the way go ahead. Yeah.
Me?
You're nodding, so I just got excited.
Well, they're warming up in a way that's familiar to them, that they're used to, that helps to get them engaged, and unlike what the others are used to, it's completely different to them, you know.
The white players have embraced African American culture, right? So that integration is not the culture staying the same, only African Americans are allowed into it. It is the genius of the minority culture educating, informing, transforming the overall culture. Is that the way we think of? Yeah.
Can't that go both ways?
Oh, exactly. Isn't that the goal of integration? But is that the vision that we have of it, right? that was Harlem Renaissance, right? The Harlem Renaissance was this explosion of genius in the African American community, and there were issues that came up, like from the African American side, what do we do with our genius? Right? Do we share it, or do we reserve it for the community? Right? For the white culture, it was, how do we respond to this explosion of genius? Do we embrace it? Do we ignore it? Do we embrace it, but only on our terms? You know, and I think if we go back and we look at that period, it's a great opportunity for us to say, what do we want our society to look like? Right? What do we want our society to look like? In the movie Black Panther, little Marvel movie, you can see where I get my culture expertise, right? Can't hold my attention for more than 30 seconds. Who can tell what happens in the first Black Panther movie? What is true? How do you describe the city that the Black Panther guy lives in? Yeah.
Wakanda is a technologically advanced city, and they deliberately hide it from the world. They don't want to share that technology with others because they feel that it'll be misused or misunderstood. So they keep it insulary, and they're far more advanced than most of the culture in the movie.
And then we have this incredible moment where who's the smartest guy in the world other than people living in Wakanda? It's Tony Stark. And Tony Stark, at one point, comes to Wakanda, where he is humbled and embraces this superior cultural moment, right? And the interesting, one of the people, Nick, that you really turned me on to, Zahra Neale Hurston, right? Who I happen to have pictures of if I wasn't too lazy. Well, I'll go up. Because one of them is to show the symmetry of the universe. One of them is on the back of your book, right? So Zahra Neale Hurston, and brilliant African-American writer during the Harlem Renaissance. And she is writing novels about African-American life that are embraced and accessible to white audiences. And she is criticized for that because it's the Wakanda thing, right? Wait a minute, this is ours, and if we share it, we may lose it, right? So I think that there is in the Harlem Renaissance this incredible moment of coming to grips with what is integration and what that means for our culture today.
Well, you look at, just using baseball, look at the Negro Leagues. The best players in baseball were in the Negro League, some of the best players, but they didn't get a chance to play with whites. And now that the Negro League is no longer there, is there still a sense of, I am the best as an African American, the best type of player? I think it's a good question to ponder. Some people would say, perhaps maybe people in my late father's era would say that was the downfall of baseball for blacks because there was integration.
Well, I mean, and when you look at, you know, even when you let's say the start of integration in Major League Baseball, when Jackie Robinson was brought in, you know, Jackie Robinson was not by anyone's estimation the best black baseball player. That's right. By any stretch of the imagination. He wasn't the fastest, he wasn't the strongest, he didn't have the best throwing arm. What he had was the best disposition to come into a hostile environment. And you see, this ends up being the sacrifice that we have to make. You know, it's and as black artisans, right? As you know, so when we talk about that, I think the last phrase that I used was, we're not the exceptions, but we can be exceptional, right? Do you have the appropriate disposition to come into a hostile environment? And this becomes a trade-off. And what happens is from the vantage point of other African Americans, right? With Zahra, and I laugh about Zahra, another Howard alum, right? Who got a B in one of Alain Locke's classes and basically said, Alain Locke was famously anti-woman. So she basically said, look, to get a B in his class was essentially like, she said, that's why I didn't go for a doctorate. I got a B in his class. That was hard enough. But when we start talking about these journeys, these excursions that African Americans make into non-Black society, as we're walking in, right? As we're driving into enemy territory, as Du Bois said, paraphrasing the Bible, why must I be a stranger in mine own land, right? We know that there's a certain disposition that we have to gain acceptance, not just for ourselves, but for those who come after us. And that becomes the challenge, right? I mean, Roy Campanella could have been first, except Roy Campanella would not struck any kind of pushback. Don Newcomb certainly could. Don Newcomb was said to be so volatile that if he said hello to you and you didn't say hi back, that might have ended up being a fight. So he probably couldn't have gotten in first either. But we start talking about these, and this is the challenge of the African American experience, which made the Harlem Renaissance such a wonderful time. It's not just about talent. It's about disposition. How do we navigate Black excellence in a way that makes non-Blacks feel comfortable enough to accept, right? And at some point, as I always say to folks, the coolest thing about getting more mature, right, is at some point, A, you figure it out, and B, you just don't care. It's like somebody walks up to me and said, and this literally did happen to me. We were talking about integration. Why would you want to be equal to us? I said, I find, with all due respect, and you already know, with all due respect. Okay, those 4 words. Anytime somebody starts with those 4 words, you already know. I said, I enjoy hanging out with you, talking to you, engaging with you. I said, but at no time in my life did I ever see myself as someone who needed to climb up to be equal. I said, I kind of, other than the fact that you restore guitars better than me, I don't think I really need to climb up. I said, in fact, in most endeavors, I kind of need to climb down. I said, so I'm not trying for equality, I'm just trying for access. And he sort of like splashed a little bit of cold water of reality on him. But again, I've got the gravitas and the age and sort of, I guess you would call it the creative insanity to be able to say something like that. Mm-hmm. But what I worry about are my younger brothers and sisters, white and Black and Latino and Asian and every other group that has this sense of trying to figure out what equality is. This is not about equality, this is about access. As I said, I love being in the company of well-written, well-spoken folk, so then you'll forgive me when I say, I ain't trying to be equal. I'm just trying to be. Now, if you want to stand in my way, then either I'm going to go over you I was gonna say around you, but I don't know if I feel like over is a more direct route. I'd just rather go over you, unless you want to move out of the way, or better yet, move one step over, one step back, turn around, and we'll walk through together. But I'm not gonna allow you to stop me, and that was our challenge. And that's where it always gets confused when we talk about integration. It's not about equality, it's about access. It's about opportunity. And you see what happens with opportunity. You let Mrs. Johnson, who just passed away at the beginning of this week, you let this black woman into NASA, and all of a sudden John Glenn won't fly a rocket.
That's right.
unless she's doing the computations. You know? You beat up those poor little girls from Compton, California for having the temerity to play tennis. Maria Sharapova just retired this week. Maria Sharapova is a multimillionaire. She ought to send a fruit basket to Serena. You know? Patrick Reed from the University of Georgia just won a golf tournament. Increased his career earnings by 25% off of one tournament. You know Tiger needs to get a little piece of that. You know, this is the stuff we think about.
Ann,
How Paul Robeson was treated. Seems to me that you're talking about access and you're talking about ability. There's a man with tremendous ability who was accepted for a while and then not accepted whatsoever after that.
Well, I mean, Paul went through it, and there was always a period where he wasn't going to be accepted. There was his entire life. There was always a period where he wouldn't get accepted. You know, he was born in Princeton, okay, and you know, Princeton at the time when he was a student still had dorms that were equipped with spaces for you to keep. Well, by that time we had evolved from slaves to servants, but there's still spaces in the dorms right now that people don't know what those little spaces are at the end of some hallways. Those were cages where you kept your slaves and then eventually your servants. He was never allowed to go there. Okay. His family was effectively chased out of Princeton because his father had the nerve, the gall, to talk about self-empowerment of the black population from the pulpit. And he was essentially chased out by Woodrow Wilson. That was when Paul was 6 years old. When he got to Somerville, his father's best friend was a Jewish man. They used to sit on each other's porches, and they got ostracized. When Paul first went to Rutgers, okay, black students were not allowed to live on campus for most of Paul's time in school, and up until the early 1970s, there was a quota on blacks and Jews, how many could live on campus at Rutgers. When he got to the football team, they knew he was the best player on the team. They tried to actually kill him. He got his shoulder separated. He got a hairline fracture in his jaw. He got his fingers stepped on, and his fingernails came off of his hands from being stepped on from the other players. After he got himself bandaged up, he went back the next day and he lifted up a player and was about to throw him to the ground, and that's when the coach told him he was on his team. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm not saying bravo to that coach. You let this man, this boy, almost get killed before you decided that you would let him on the team when you realized that you couldn't kill him. I think that's a metaphor for the black experience. You know, when he goes to Columbia Law School, by the way, he went to Columbia Law School, he was commuting from Akron, Ohio, as one of the pioneering players in the National Football League. He's commuting from Akron to Northern Manhattan, as one of my colleagues who went to Columbia calls it, but I'll call it Harlem. Commuting from Akron to Harlem. And when he got out, finished his law degree, he had a hard time practicing. You know, so I mean, there was never, you know, when he changed the words to Old Man River, okay, there were racial epithets in the original version of that song. He insisted that they be changed, and that was immortality. So we're talking about a life of always struggling. You know, and so yeah, he got it tough. And then, you know, once he went before the House Un-American Activities Committee and refused to declare whether or not he was a communist or a socialist, you know, he gets ostracized. And you know, my wife's family grew up in Somerville, New Jersey, which is where Paul grew up, and her grandfather actually was babysat by Paul. I was conducting research on Paul's life, and people would whisper to me. They'd look around before they'd even tell me stuff, and Paul had been dead by this time 20 years. You know, so it takes a while sometimes when someone has what we call a radicalized view. You know, we could be a communist, we could be a socialist, we could be an atheist, we can be a whole bunch of different things. But to be radicalized about issues of race is a very, very difficult thing, and remains as such. So yeah, he did. He lived a very difficult life, but he made out okay. You know, he was eventually vindicated. Rutgers finally advocated for him to be in the Hall of Fame. They've named several buildings after him. But you know what it took for that point. You know, he was the most famous man in the world. There are places in this world where people have never seen other black people, and they have Paul Robeson records. And it took you 100 years after he graduated to start naming stuff after him. I'm not sure if it ever stopped.
It's always very humbling for me to sit on a panel with people who actually know things. Because you have Randall talking about the life of Paul Robeson, and then Nick shows up and he brings books that he's actually read. And then I go up and say, because we're talking about journeys of important figures in African American life and history, and then I go and I watch This Is Us. The journey to become Randall Pierce, and again, talk about journeys. But I think that for me, and again, the dynamic of the Harlem Renaissance, one of the issues of the Harlem Renaissance, and Randall, you mentioned access, right? And one of the important dynamics of access, I think, is not only access to culture, but as Nick has really dedicated his life, access to the best person that you can be, right? How do we give people access to the best person that they can be? And there's a wonderful period in This Is Us where Randall Pearson has to pick the college where he's going to attend. And for those of you who kind of follow, Randall is this mathematical genius. And he begins, anybody know the series, where does he start looking first? Where does parents want him to go? Ivy League, that's exactly, you're gonna find yourself, you're gonna access who you can be if you go to Harvard, right? And then Randall has this kind of epiphany, and he says, wait a minute, where I'm gonna find my genius, where I'm gonna find my excellence is if I go to, anybody know the next place he looks? Howard. Right? Because I need to establish my identity as an African American person. And then he ultimately ends up going, anybody know? In Pittsburgh, right? He goes to Carnegie Mellon. Slow day, life's hard, right? But he goes to Carnegie Mellon. Do you remember why? Close to home. That's right. His dad has just died. And he's like, if I'm gonna become everything I can become, I gotta stay linked into my family, right? And as you look at these three periods in Randall's life, there's this recognition that the path to your excellence is not one size fits all, right? And as we figure out the way that American culture needs to be shaped, it needs to be shaped in a way that recognizes that different people are going to reach excellence going in different directions, right? Zahra Neale Hurston, one of the, it's very interesting, she was kind of ambivalent toward movements toward integration. It wasn't that, I mean, here's a woman who's publishing books that give access to everybody, right? So she's not opposed to integration. But she was afraid that if we embraced as a culture integration, the traditionally African-American colleges would disappear, or they would lose their identity. And if they lost their identity, then that would foreclose one pathway for African Americans to embrace their excellence. Which I think is just sort of a fascinating issue. But anyway, before we wrap this up, give you guys a chance to have the final words. Any last thoughts that you want to?
My wife usually has the final word. She's
There you go. There you go.
bonus point for me.
And she was the one who knew things today.
Uh-huh.
But we let you sit on the panel because I like you.
There you go.
There you go.
But I want to thank you two gentlemen for coming in. Wonderful time. Thank you so much for your work.
If I can be a little tacky, I taught on the Delaware campus for a number of years. We never had anything like this. We never had anything like this there. And so this school needs to be commended for what you've done.
Indeed. Hear, hear.
Well, thank you. You guys have a 5-minute break, but don't go away because the show is going to continue to be good. Am I right? First of all, let me begin by saying that Derrick Henry made it as difficult as possible for me to do an introduction. So I asked him, because you really, I mean, effectively, you don't have a website.
Nope.
No, right?
For
So,
you, yeah.
so the normal process is you just go to the web and you download their bio and then you steal stuff off of that. And of course you would say, well, is this because you're like socially ineffective, Randy, because you've known this guy for, what have I known you for, almost 30 years or something?
30 plus.
Yeah, so, but no, just because I know somebody for 30 years doesn't mean that I could say anything about them. So anyway, I'm like, Derrick, you need to shoot me your resume, your bio. And he's like, I don't have a resume. I don't have a bio. I don't need a resume. I don't need a bio. I don't apply for jobs. You know, I work for myself. You know, who I used to be isn't what you need to know. Who I am today may or may not be who I will be tomorrow. Right? I don't need any of that. Right? And I'm like, great, Derrick. I love the philosophical insights, but I still need one from you. Right? So he just says, okay, you want to introduce me. Just say, and this is true, right? You said this. Just say Derrick Henry is one of Randy Lee's go-to guys. Right? And I wrote that down, and I stared at it, and I said, you know, that actually works, right? That kind of, I could, if I was doing the traditional introductory thing, I could say that Derrick, sole practitioner, his practice is focused on civil matters, primarily in the area of medical malpractice. Tort guy. Good stuff, right? You know, he also does real estate, or he also does estate and family law matters, handles contract disputes. But the nature, the substance of his practice really isn't the point. The point is that Derrick Henry represents people. And when he represents people, it is always about a person and the presence of a problem that needs to be solved. That is what it means for him to be a lawyer. He, by the way, does get paid. But in 30 years of work and of knowing him, I have never gotten the sense that it was about the payment. It was about the person and the resolution of the problem. Derrick, by the way, is a Widener Law School graduate. And among the many ways that he continues to contribute to the law school is that he gives countless hours supporting Widener students both while they are in law school and also during their transition to becoming members of the bar. So we very much appreciate all that you do for the law school. Todd Shell is also a Widener Commonwealth School of Law graduate. He was in the first class that I taught To Kill a Mockingbird too. And I didn't permanently damage him, so that was good. And about Todd, I can say that he is one of the most innovative, creative, imaginative, entrepreneurial guys that I know, right? He has succeeded in doing what I don't think anyone would have thought possible. He has built a major entertainment law practice in Lower Paxton Township, right? He is co-founder of Pillar and Ought, which has two really cool names in it, neither of which belongs to anybody in the law firm. For almost 2 decades, Todd has represented many of America's most well-known film and TV production companies, actors, musicians, authors, and AHL and NHL sports figures. Todd has recently served as production counsel for projects for the History Channel, Discovery Channel, MTV, A&E, Animal Planet, Bravo Networks, and regularly represents clients in conjunction with production companies, publishers, entertainment groups, and major networks including Simon & Schuster, NBC Universal, TLC, Lifetime, LMW, VH1, BET, WETV, and Netflix. And I was going to throw in some random letters and just see if anybody picked up that wasn't real, but then I thought no. Todd also has extensive experience representing employers in all aspects of employment law, and has acted as lead litigation counsel for large corporations as well as small and medium-sized businesses. Needless to say, again, Widener is extremely proud of what each of these individuals has done with their Widener degree, and in particular with how they have done that work with their Widener degree. Two very, very dear friends of mine. And with no further ado, I'm going to ask Derrick Henry to share his experiences as a lawyer and as a parent, ushering a Harrisburg native to network stardom.
First and foremost, I have to say that I've had interaction with Todd as opposing counsel in the past. And by the time we leave here today, I will be hiring Todd to represent my daughter. You'll see on the video monitor, it's my daughter. She acted on season 2, episode 7 of New Amsterdam. That's on NBC. And her journey was rather interesting. Here's what someone told me once. You do not push someone professionally. You do not pull someone professionally. You walk at the side of that person. And by walking at the side of that person, you see what they see, you hear what they hear, and you can become a companion to that person. Okay? So I took my daughter to Colonial Park Mall, and she sees this Barbizon little kiosk hanging out there, and she says, Dada, she calls me Dada. Dada, I want to do that. I'm like, we're here to get your ears pierced. We're not doing that. And she went, I really, really want to do it. And I'm like, no, you're not. She said, does Mama know you're getting my ears pierced? I'm like, no. She said, okay, then we're going to do it. And, she has 2 parents that are attorneys, so we negotiate everything. So we went, and at the end of the process, she's hooked. She has the bug. and she wants to act. And I know that I've been told by Randy and by numerous adults, the worst thing you can do to your children is to say, no, don't do it. Because they dig their heels in and they proceed to do it. So I decided, opposite tack, I'm just going to go along for the ride. And I'm just going to go, and whatever she wants to do, she wants to do. So we end up there's a cruise that comes up once a year for aspiring talent entities and individuals in central Pennsylvania. So we went to on the cruise, and someone decided, a talent manager decided that he liked Zahra and he wanted to work with her. And the net fallout of that was she has a acting coach who she sees once a week. He's in LA, and so once a week, every week from 4:30 to 5:30 religiously for the past 18 months, she is coached. And she, after being coached for a year, he said, we need to move to the next step and the next level, and she got a manager. We sent 1 or 2 tapes to the manager, and she got an audition for this, and now she is an actress. And she likes it. And her father dislikes it. But it's not about the father and not about what I like or what I want to do, but she wants to do it. And she's getting really, really good exposure. But her father is so intellectually motivated, and acting is it's such a social thing that it does not go well with both of us. But we do it. After doing this, someone saw it and they asked her to audition for a lead on a Netflix series. And the Netflix series got full funding. And the writer-producer of the series, I will not say her name, but she's a comedian, and she's all the way out there. In terms of her comedy and her comedy sketches, it's out there. And so when we got the call, they only auditioning 2 individuals for the lead. So, and if she's not picked for the lead, then she is going to be a supporting person in the household. So my daughter is guaranteed to get something on Netflix. And the script comes over. And the script is for a dysfunctional African-American family where the son is 21 years old, living at home, and he has like gender identity. At any point in time, he is male, he's a female. Father is recently out of being incarcerated. He has spent several years in jail. And so my daughter gets this script, and she looks at, I look at it first, and I say, no way in that she's going to do it. But she has not had a lot of experience, so I do not want to deny someone the opportunity. I usually, when I counsel young attorneys or people who just graduated, I said, do not reject the job before you've had a job offer. Okay? You shouldn't do that. So I got it and I looked at it, and the 3rd line of the script has her swearing in front of her dad. Her line, she has to drop the F-bomb twice in front of him. And she has this script, and she's looking at it, and she's looking at me. I said, it's acting. You have to step out of yourself and do it. She tried for, what? She tried for about 2 hours. She couldn't do it. And I left the room, and she still couldn't do it. Eventually, her coach, she had to call her coach, and they worked in it and worked in it and worked in it. And she did it, and it was an excellent audition. I got it. I had to do the final editing, I cut out about 45 seconds of it, and she never got the part. It was the happiest day of my life. You know, it was the happiest day of my life because we still have to exercise control over talent. We still have to do what's right for talent, and we still have to do it for kids. And I'm going to circle right back to the practice of law now. One thing I tell my clients all the time is, if I'm going to represent you, I do not want the self-help approach. Because every time we engage in self-help, I make more money and you walk away angry because you go online and you get a snippet of something and then you decide that's what should happen. So you call me and you say, hey, Derrick, can we do this? Can we do this? Can we try this? Can we try that? And I say, no, you don't do that. And I fell prey to myself, and I did not take my own advice. So when we got the contract for New Amsterdam, what I should have done was I should have called this man here and say, we have a contract. I need someone to review it. I do not have the expertise. I review contracts, and I write contracts on a regular basis for my clients, big and small. But I've never done one in the entertainment industry, and nor will I ever do one. But you're caught up in the human conflict, okay? Because now I don't see myself as an attorney. I see myself as a parent. I see myself as a parent who's trying to help my kid. And she's saying, Dada, it's an opportunity. If we don't sign this, I won't get it. And in the back of my head, I'm saying, I don't know what I'm signing. And the best thing I could have done is to go to the expert and say, review this for me. But I had her manager, and her manager is saying, it's a basic contract. Sign it. You lose nothing. I had her coach saying, it's a basic contract. Sign it. And I had my daughter, I had her twin sister, I had her mother. I think I even had my 200-pound Great Dane telling me, sign it. And I signed it. And it was okay, because every now and again, you get away with doing something that you shouldn't do. It was okay because it was one episode, and the contract was a 10-day contract. But even when I'm reviewing all like 50 or 60 pages of it, in the back of my head, I'm just saying, if I tell Todd this, he's going to hate me. He's going to hate me. You know? And so at the end of the day, the professional is the one we go to. When we have clients, we need to counsel our clients. You might not want to work with us, but you work with a professional. So it always brings up some interesting dynamics, especially when it's personal to you. Do you go with a professional? Do you do it on your own because you've been practicing law for 25 years? And then you look and you have a kid and you say, I also have to do the right thing for my kid. And when you put all three of them together, you always hope you're doing the right thing. And in hindsight, more often than not, it turns out that what you did was wrong, but I'm lucky in that sense. But like I said, by the time I leave here today, Todd is going to have my information on a personal sense, not professionally. And the next time something comes up, we will hopefully use him. I mean, right, like in the next 2 hours, she has another audition, and this one is really, really interesting. She has an audition for a lead of a new series again. She's lucky enough to be getting auditions for projects that have already been funded. But this one is being filmed in South Africa. And it's about an interracial kid who's going to a white-only school and the problems that she encounters there. And at 13 years old, she does not appreciate the conflicts and the dynamics of that type of filming, where they're going to film. And so I know for a fact that if she gets the part, then you're going to be my man.
I'm in.
You're going to be my man. So tell us what you do. Yeah, you know, now you're going to be singing for your supper, so tell me what you do.
Well, before I let Todd jump in, there is a dynamic here, and this is actually, for those of you here for CLE credit, in case we ever get audited, you know, they're going to want to hear some rule numbers so you get the ethics credit too, right? So let me just say the rule 1.18, right? So you don't even need to know what it is, but just trust me, it's a real rule. But anyway, for conflicts, but when you were talking, Derrick, about that dynamic of representing your daughter, or being in the, not even representing, but being in the flow of this with your daughter, there's a couple of conflict dynamics that jump out at me. And I'd love to have your perspective. And you talked about that dynamic that you don't have to be an entertainment lawyer to have experienced, where you are asked to do a legal task, right? Or you have to do a legal task for yourself, and it is not your area of expertise, right? And you've got to decide if you're going to let your ego dictate what you do, which is to say, well, excuse me, I'm a lawyer, or you're going to let your common sense dictate what you do and say, but I'm not this kind of lawyer. And just because I do contracts all the time doesn't mean that I'm capable of examining this contract. You unfortunately had to experience that in front of an audience of the most important people in your life, and your dog staring at you, which makes it harder to put the ego thing aside. But the other conflict that I think is fascinating, because I experienced this myself, and I have no idea how to navigate it. 1.8 conflicts, special kinds of conflicts, it talks about that lawyers should not have romantic relationships with their clients that they start after they have their client, right? And hopefully that would be common sense. That's not the challenge. The challenging thing for me is the conflict that arises, and whether I can handle it and whether my kids can or my wife can handle it, to represent someone when you have a pre-existing relationship with them. And are they going to know, are they going to understand when you're not functioning as the spouse, or you're not functioning as the parent, right? In my house, believe it or not, in my house, my children routinely, actually my wife and my children, routinely ignore me, right? Oh my gosh, he's talking again. You know, why would I ever listen to that, right? And that's okay, I get that, right? That is our relationship, right? But when they ask me to function as their father or as their lawyer, they can't ignore me in the same way, right? If I, as their lawyer, say, you need to do this, they can't say, you know, who do you think you are, right? Or they don't even say that, they just go do whatever they want. So my question is, you're working with your daughter on this. How do you navigate that minefield of, I mean, if you start, advising her, whatever, how do you navigate the minefield of, right now, I am not functioning as your dad. I'm not advising you as your dad. I am talking to you as your lawyer, and the relationship that we have, dad-daughter, different rules now. When I'm functioning as your lawyer, we got to function on different rules. Do you find that dynamic? Do you not find that? Do you just smart enough to ignore that all entirely? What do you do there?
No, it's an interesting dynamic, and for me, I think it's harder, and it's going to be harder than it is for most individuals, because with a similarly aged companion or friend or anything like that, it's easy to explain that. But when you have a kid who has looked up to you all her life, and you can do no wrong, you have positioned yourself to be the fact finder, you have positioned yourself to be the one who's always right all the time. And you layer on top of that you're an attorney. And then you layer on top of that the fact that you do a lot of contract work. And she knows that. How do you go to that person and say, you're not competent for this? Okay? And how do you do that from the standpoint, well, knowing full well that, you know, that image of you, of yourself that you have created with your daughter, it will be shattered. That's personal. And you have to juxtapose that with the rule of professional responsibility. How do you walk away from that? And I submit to you that I was lucky. I was lucky that I had a 10-day contract, that it came, it went, nothing wrong happened, but I know I can't do that again. You know, because to do it again, when she turns 19 and she looks back and she sees that the contracts were not in her best interest, because hindsight is always 20/20, and she decides to go to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court and bring me up on an ethical complaint. There is no professional responsibility attorney in central Pennsylvania who's going to defend my actions. Because they're going to say, was that your daughter or was that your client? Did you tell her that she should seek counsel somewhere else because of a conflict of interest? And I did not. So I have the name and number of everyone in here, so if I get a complaint tomorrow, I'll track you down, okay? You know, but that's what we are struck with. And it's hard because it's the core of what I do. You know, for example, I have written trust documents. There are like 3 trust documents that the U.S. Department of Justice uses in their civil cases. I drafted those documents for them because at one point in time, I consulted with the Department of Justice in D.C. I've written that. I've written 15, 20, 25-page trust documents for major insurance companies. But you know what I've not done? I did not write my own irrevocable trust that I have. I did not. Because I don't want myself as a client. Nothing good will ever come of that. No matter how great you think you are. Don't write your own will. Okay? Don't write your own power of attorney. Get someone else to write it. Spend a few dollars. Get a friend and let them do it. And with all that body of knowledge, I still stepped into that quagmire. So, you know, we're going to know it. We're going to know it, and sometimes we ignore it because the challenge is the emotional side of it. And the bigger challenge is that when it's a kid who looks up to you and you could do no wrong, and then you have to say, go to Todd. Okay? But you should do it, and you should always do it, because even though what we do and the practice of law is very, very gray, when it comes to professional responsibility, and especially the conflicts there, it is extremely black and white. And so it's not happening again.
Well, for those of you who did not pick this up, when Derrick said, how do I deal with that? That was not rhetorical. That was a request for legal advice. You all have been retained. The attorney-client privilege has asserted itself, right? Another ethics lesson. So you cannot rat him out now. That opportunity has been foreclosed. So, and we know that you weren't on your cell phone while he was telling the story to report him, because nobody goes on their cell phone during a CLE. But anyway, so Todd, I think Derrick, before I interrupted, had kicked things over to you. So if you could just talk about what you do, how you got started, how you interact with the people that you represent. That would be a great way to get started.
Can I channel my Professor Lee and stand up?
You can do whatever you want.
Okay, so first of all, I have to say it's a little surreal and an honor to be back here. As Professor Lee said, he was my first professor, so 1990 is when it was. And it's always fun to be here, and we've had some great discussions leading up to this. But thank you for coming. I do want to talk about how I got started, because it's so unusual in this day and age to do what I did because of technology, and I'll explain that in a minute. So when I graduated here from Widener...
Can I interrupt you for 1 minute?
Sure.
If you're a law student, okay, even if you're not a law student, but this may well be the most important lesson that you get in law school, right? So you need to listen to how Todd started his practice, right? Because you may want to do this someday. Not in this context, but in any context. So go ahead.
No pressure there. So also, by the way, I've already learned this morning in the half hour how many ethical violations I committed in building my practice. So this is good. So I graduated here in 1993, and at the time, I'd come from Philadelphia, and at the time, I was a huge fan of independent film. And I was a fan of independent film for all the reasons you heard about during the first part of this symposium. I loved being able to see other cultures. I loved being exposed to different worlds. You know, reading subtitles in a film, while some people still struggle with it, I never did. I enjoyed it, and that's what I loved about independent film. But 1993 in Harrisburg, no such thing. No such thing at all. So one of the things I started was to build, and it still exists today, is the Midtown Cinema. And that's downtown. There's 3 screens there, independent film, but I had to raise the money for it. So the first thing I had to do was testify before City Council here in Harrisburg to explain to them what independent film was, and specifically to tell them that it's not porn film. That's what they thought it was. So I'm trying to build an independent film cinema here. Just graduated. I started to work at Rhodes & Sinan, which is a law firm no longer in existence, but existed for many, many years here. And I was a law clerk there, an employment lawyer, but I wanted to work in the arts. That's what I really wanted to do. So as I built this cinema, I started to get known as the film guy, just because I built a cinema and I knew a lot about independent film, but I didn't know anything about film production or anything along those lines. But I got known as the film guy in what, compared to other cities, was a very small town. And so whenever film would come into Harrisburg, whether it be Paramount Pictures or Columbia to shoot film, they would somehow call me. They'd say, we heard you're the film guy, and we need somebody locally to help out with the production. So, all right. So I had to fake it a lot until I got to the point that I really did understand the industry. But think about this time period. In the early 90s, there was no internet, cell phone, smartphone, all that stuff. So what I would do is I'd wake up in the morning, probably around 2 or 3 in the morning, and I'd go to a movie set. We shot some big budget, major films around this area. So I'd go to the film set, and I'd do anything possible they wanted me to do. So I was a production assistant a lot of times. I ran coffee for people. I ran any errand there was. In one movie, they asked me to be John Travolta's bodyguard in going out to a scene in the show. Now, I don't know if any of you have been around him. He's like 7 foot tall, this guy, big guy. I'm his bodyguard. But I did anything I needed to do. I would do all that to learn the industry, and then I'd go back to work at Rhodes & Sinan. They had no idea that I was working as a production assistant on these films until they were over, and I told them. But that's what I started to do to kind of learn the business. At the same time, I got very much into meeting musicians, local musicians, and local actors and production companies, and some of them went on to do some great things. So I had volunteered my time, a lot of volunteering, lots of pro bono work, to these musicians who went on to become gigantic stars. So I worked with bands that came out of here like Live and Fuel, and bands that went on to sell millions and millions of records when there was a such thing as records. But what it did was it plugged me into the entertainment industry. So from around here, as Randy said, living around here, it seems improbable that you would be in that kind of career. But what happens is the entertainment industry, as Derrick is going to find out, is very, very small. Very, very small. Everybody knows everybody. If you burn a bridge here, you're never going to work again. That's truly the kind of world that they live in. So if you do good work, I started to do work as a production counsel. You do good work, you start to get known in the industry. And I was lucky because technology had started to change when I became an expert in this area. So at the time I started to really do a lot of work in TV and film, it was the same time that we did have the internet and FaceTime. And I was able to now not have to travel to LA and New York all the time for work. I could build a practice from here based solely on reputation and other work I had done. But what's really important, I think, to this particular symposium is when I started out, I was very much working on the side of the talent. I was very much interested, and still am, in the talent's perspective, what they bring to the arts. So to me, I wanted to work with the songwriters and the musicians. I wanted to work with the actors and the actresses. I wanted to work with the directors of photography and the cinematographers and the directors. I wanted to work with them because I'm fascinated by the creative process. And what I didn't know, that I now know after all these years, is that being a lawyer, an entertainment lawyer that does specifically what I do, which is production counsel, is that you are so close to the creative process that oftentimes, if you're doing your job right, the producers and the writers and the directors will turn to you as a lawyer and say, what do you think about this idea? How does it work? Does it not work? Tell me about the legal implications of what you do. And that, to me, is the most fascinating part of what production counsel gets to do. We are very much creative, and we do give legal support, but our job is to stimulate that creative growth as opposed to try to, I'll tell you, there's lots of lawyers who just want to put out fires. That's not what a production lawyer should do. We should try to find a way to let the storytellers tell their story and let the art flourish as a result. And I heard this line this morning in Professor Westbrook's presentation where he said, civil rights by copyright. I love that. I love that so much because that is exactly where I find myself today. So what happened over the years is I worked a lot in music. Music is kind of dead now in a lot of ways. It's very difficult to make money in the music world right now. Film, major motion pictures, not the business it was years ago, very different. Everything I do, almost everything I do from the time I wake up until the time I go to sleep now in my job is on television. It's television work. So all the shows that I work on are made specifically for television or streaming services now. So one of the things I focus on, and I have for a lot of years now, is, and this will invoke all kinds of weird thoughts, but reality television. I do a lot of reality series. And while reality series, I recognize I'm not Martin Scorsese, I get that. Reality series are a lot of individuals' guilty pleasures. They kind of don't talk about what they love, the characters they love, the shows they watch. But let me tell you what I think it really does a great job with. One of the things I have focused on is try to introduce mainstream audiences to cultures that they would not normally get introduced to. And that's sort of what we're talking about here with the Harlem Renaissance, about embracing the idea of learning other cultures and letting others help sort of pull behind the curtain to see what those cultures are like. And one of the things we did right here in central Pennsylvania are all those Amish shows you've seen on television. So I started off doing a show called Breaking Amish. And what we did was we took individuals, Amish teenagers, who were getting ready to go through Rumspringa, where they get to experience the world and decide whether they want to be Amish. And we took them and we threw them out to New York and we threw them to LA and let them experience English culture. But at the same time, what we were really doing were teaching American audiences, the Amish call you English, the English audiences, we were teaching you about Amish culture. And that show became so popular that it spun off into a show called Return to Amish, which, believe it or not, we just got picked up for a new season. It's been on for all these years on TLC. So we continue to do this. We did the same thing, well, little different, maybe may invoke a little different reaction, but Amish Mafia was a huge show for us. Huge show. It was on Discovery Channel. It was Discovery Channel's highest rated show to date. And it was an amazing series because at the beginning of the show, if you go back and watch it, we put up a disclaimer at the very beginning. So you want to talk about lawyer stuff. We put up a disclaimer at the very beginning that said, the events that you are about to see are not real. They are recreations of things that happened, okay? Right at the front of every episode. But when we toured the country in book deals and introducing these actors to, I say actors, to the real world, everybody thought they were real characters. Tell me what it's like to work in the Amish Mafia, and you went after this person, how they feel about you. No, we recreated this show. It was recreations. These were individuals that were brought to the table, and the stories that we told were very real. We talked to individuals, Mennonite, Amish, and they told us real stories that we portrayed on the show. But it wasn't necessarily real, they were recreations. And at the same time, we were bringing all this knowledge of Amish culture to American audiences who were fascinated with it because you don't get to see that. Yeah, if you go down to Lancaster, you're going to see the tours, you're going to see how they churn and raise barns and that sort of thing. You're not going to really see what it's like to be Amish. And these stories were very real. So it sparked that whole process of those shows becoming so popular, gave us an idea to start showing different cultures that are not traditionally exposed to mainstream audiences. And so we have done a whole host of those shows now. The one that I talked to Professor Lee about, because I really am excited about it, is a show that we just finished for Netflix. It'll be on soon. It's a reality series called Deaf U. And what it is it follows 7 or 8 college students at Gallaudet University in Washington, in DC, and that is an all-deaf college. And yes, the way we make an audience connect to this is we have characters on the show that are fun or interesting, and you want to follow them from a soap opera standpoint. And some may look at it and say, trash TV, or what are you really getting out of it? But I'll tell you what you're getting out of it. You're going to learn an awful lot about deaf culture, an awful lot of things that you will be surprised and shocked to know about deaf individuals, which obviously helps to integrate that culture into the world that we live in as hearing people. And it is absolutely fascinating. So that's the kind of show that we start to work on. Probably, very significant for this symposium. Last summer, I think it was last summer, I did a show on Bravo called Your Husband is Cheating on Us. And it was a limited series, and that title is the name of a play written by a urban theatrical director and writer and actor named J.D. Lawrence. And what I learned during making this series is that there is a huge market for urban theater, plays that are written and directed by African American individuals. And these plays tour around the country. And I am embarrassed to say, and I'm into the arts, that I never heard of these plays prior to making this TV series. Never heard of these plays. And what we learned, the series ran on Bravo, and what it did, it took the actors in. They all lived in a house together, because every reality series, you got to live in a house together, right? Live in a house together. And they wrote the play, rehearsed the play, and then went out on the road and performed the play. And so even I was able to be exposed to that form of art that I had no exposure to previously. That's the kind of stuff that we find really interesting. And we're so kind of dedicated to that idea of bringing other cultures to mainstream audience that even shows where you wouldn't think we do it, we find a way to do it for you. So there's a show I'm working on right now. I think we're going into our 3rd season right now. It's on Animal Planet on Sunday evenings. It's called Extinct or Alive. And what it is we go each week into a different country, and we find or try to find an animal that was once thought to be extinct. And in doing so, we want to make sure that we expose all of you who are watching it to the culture of the particular place we're going. You know, our host is a guy named Forrest Galante, who grew up in Zimbabwe, and he was, at a very young age, his family was threatened to leave because of political unrest, and we work that into a seemingly, you know, kind of vanilla Animal Planet show on Sunday nights where we're trying to find an animal. We try to work that culture in. So to me, you know, what you see, you know, Professor Lee throws up, Remember the Titans up on the screen here earlier today. One of the ways that we are doing exactly what the Harlem Renaissance was doing, we're doing it on film and TV. We're trying to expose audiences to cultures that they would not normally be exposed to. And that is a real goal of what I do. I know that when Randy and I talked, we talked a lot about the role that I play in doing this, because it is a bit unique from a lawyer standpoint. I have to wear many hats because I represent many parties in one particular creative process. So in one particular show, if you take one show out there, I will be representing not only the production company that puts the show together. I could be representing, depending on conflict waivers, I could be representing talent on the show. I could be representing crew on the show. I also have to represent the distributor or the network. So I also have to represent A&E or Netflix or MTV or VH1 or any of the other acronyms you heard this morning. I have to represent all of them because they fund it. So what happens is a production company comes up with an idea. We go ahead, protect the intellectual property. We go out there and develop the idea. We do contracts with the cast and crew. And then my clients, the production companies, sell that product to a Netflix or to an A&E or to another network. And then what happens at that point, as a lawyer, you become the lawyer for the network as well, because you're all on the same page. I'm responsible to control the budget and that sort of thing. So it's sort of like when if you get out of law school and you work on a case that has insurance, you find yourself working for the insured, but you're also working for the insurance company. So these are the kinds of issues that you deal with all the time and that are very difficult to walk those lines. Very, very difficult. And you have to always remember that you are wearing multiple hats. You have to disclose what your motivations are. But ultimately, maybe this is one area that's very unique in the law. I myself personally am so dedicated to finding the story and finding the art that I'm willing to talk to my clients about the risks. Yes, we have a defamation risk or a disparagement risk or this kind of risk, but how else are we going to tell the story if we don't take a little bit of that risk? So unlike a lot of areas, I'm regularly counseling my clients that they should be taking risk and as much of it as they can deal with, because that's the only way we get to tell the real story in this business. All the documentaries that we do, all the documentaries come with risk. We're doing one right now where it's very risky. I can't disclose too much of it, but I'll just tell you generally that we are doing a documentary where we are following a particular individual based on a whole nother subject matter. And during the filming of that documentary, we believe that, and have now learned that this individual we've been following has not been truthful with us, and in fact is implicated in multiple crimes, very serious crimes, very serious. We have to be careful how to tell our story now. We want to expose what we now know, but we have to watch the defamation risk, the disparagement risk, all kinds of other legal risks that come out of it. But we want to tell the story because it's an important story to tell. So as a lawyer, I am constantly telling these individuals, take the risk. Here's what it is. I disclose it, and here's what could happen, but do you want to tell the story? Do you want that art to be out there the way you want it? Do you want to paint that picture the way you want to paint it? Then we have to be willing to take chances in those areas. So it's really, to me, very fascinating. I don't sometimes know where the line is between lawyer and producer, or lawyer and director, or lawyer and showrunner. I don't know anymore because I find that it bleeds over so much. But to me, it's very important to be able to understand the law in whatever area you're in. I mean, we do a lot of shows where we have a show right now, speaking of bringing cultures to other things, we have a show we're doing right now for MTV, and it's a show where we're following a number of teenagers who live on the border of Nogales, Arizona, and Nogales, Mexico. And again, typical reality series, all the characters you could think of, types of characters, but we're exposing the challenges they have living there during this time period. They are very much aware and address the idea of building a wall and the stereotypes and all that kind of stuff. And so we're dealing with that. But to me, we have issues that you wouldn't think of filming on a daily basis. They go into Mexico for a nightclub scene, and there's individuals there who may be under the age that are drinking. Well, as a production crew, there are certain jurisdictions that have duty to report laws that require us to call law enforcement if we see a crime being committed. You know, if we shoot a series for a network where we're following an EMS crew, and there's an individual who's ODing on illegal drugs or substances, there's certain jurisdictions where we have to report that to law enforcement. So think about when we sit in a room, we talk about that and we say, hey, if we go into the nightclub and we see this, we may have to deal with this. So how about if we shoot it here and we don't let certain individuals come in or drink or something along those lines? So the legal and the creative are just married together through, you know, being an entertainment lawyer. And it's to me, I find it incredibly rewarding. I don't think it's a challenge or a drag. I think it's incredibly rewarding to try to find your way around that kind of stuff and to still be able to tell the story that you'd like to tell.
I have a question. I have a question for you, and I'm going to bring it right back home.
Yep.
So you have.
By the way, you haven't offended anybody.
Well, I wish I did. That'd be awesome.
They're actually leaving to go to Professor Deem's class.
Oh, no, Deem said you can miss it. It's fine. It's fine. I sat through it. There wasn't really much covered anyway.
Tell him Todd said that, not me.
Just joking, of course.
But thank you all for coming. So you were saying.
Okay, so my daughter is your client, okay? And she is cast for something that in the minority community she does not think will represent and will not portray her as a minority. It would not portray her in a good light. And she's extremely apprehensive about this scene. And she's your client. How do you navigate that with production?
Well, I mean, that's really common issue, and one that is looked at through a variety of different lenses. From her perspective, she should and be very careful about defining who she is as an actress and the types of roles she likes to take. There is a real feeling that typecasting in Hollywood is something you need to be very wary of. And so I do think that it's incumbent upon any actor or artist to decide what project they want to be associated with. There are some who look at it solely as an acting challenge. I am so different from that person that when I deliver this performance, they're going to give me an Academy Award because I am so different from this person and I'm going to just live this character and be real in this character. Some that see it that way. And others that take the stand, I'm simply not going to do it. Now, here's the underlying premise of the entertainment business. If she's not willing to do it, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of people that will do it. So that is the way production companies and directors and casting directors look at it. If you don't want to do it and you can't get yourself into that role and embody that character, I'm going to move on because I need someone who can truly embody that character for realism purposes. So that is a very important concept. I've watched a number of actors take roles that they later come back to and say they wish they had not taken that because they simply can't get out of that lane afterwards. It's very, very difficult to get out of that lane. You know, recently, you guys all remember Steve Carell from The Office, and you know the character that he played on The Office. He's a beloved comedy actor. Well, if any of you have just watched The Morning Show, which is Apple TV Plus's series on the Me Too movement, and Steve Carell basically plays a Matt Lauer character. It's really who he's playing, a Matt Lauer character. And describing what he's experiencing during the Me Too movement, and he's everything, all the the evil and the misunderstood and everything wrapped up. You watch that performance, and you're going to sit back and go, "Wow, Steve Carell is an amazing actor. He is not the Office guy in real life. He's not this guy in real life. He's an actor." But it's so hard to be able to do that. So, but I think at her age 13, I would be taking roles and doing jobs that she is comfortable doing. It's hard enough to act, let alone to have that extra, baggage on top. But again, there are millions of people lined up that would say, I'll take that role even if I don't agree with it. But it is a personal choice that every artist has to make.
One of the things that I find this really engaging, even though no one in the entertainment industry will ever know me or retain me, because we are essentially, as lawyers, and I think this is one of the great misconceptions or mistakes that we have in legal education, there is a perception as a law student that you become a lawyer and people drop the facts on you, or they drop the story on, and it's a nice little package, and it's all there because whenever you read a case, that's what you saw right at the beginning. Here's this nice story. And the reality is, for at least my experience, you are either inundated with information, much of which is relevant and much of which is not, right? Or some of which is relevant and most of it is not. Or the client, the prospective witnesses, the evidence, there's none. Can't you get me what I want without me telling you anything, right? And you have to enter this environment, and you have to facilitate, you have to find, you have to, and I don't mean to say lie, but the word suggest, but that's not what I'm talking about. You have to create story, right? And there's a lot of what we do that is the equivalent, Todd, as we've talked about, of reality television. Because you walk into this mass of digital imagery and information, and you have to help the client find their story, which through no fault of their own, they may not even understand, because they may just be so overwhelmed with their life that they can't find their story. You've got to find their story in the midst of all this information. And if you do it well, no one will know that you were ever present. Right? That's reality television. You know, Todd was telling the story about, Amish whatever, and, everybody, Amish Mafia, and everybody thought it was real. Reality television works when you think that it really is 30 minutes shot in 30 minutes real time. Right? And so, what is, just to both Derrick, you as a litigator, Todd as both litigator production, how do you go about helping your client find the story in their life, find the, or share the story in their life, create the story for their life?
Yeah, well, one of the things, you teed it up really nicely. So reality television, again, I recognize all the stereotypes of, I'm very self-aware on what the stereotypes are about reality television, but to Randy's point, here's how reality television, I had explained this to my 13-year-old daughter, because she would watch reality television and she would see this, and I'd say to her this thing, I say it all the time, If you notice during these two are having dinner at a restaurant, and do you notice that when the camera's on one of them when they're talking, you don't see the cameras behind, and then the camera's on this person, and you never see the cameras? I said, that's because we shoot the scene multiple times. They're having that conversation multiple times in order to get the scene shot. And so it was like a light bulb went off for us. I said, yeah, we rehearse, we do the scenes, we do them again. But the reason it's reality is because prior to a season starting, we sit down with the characters of the show. So Amish, for example, if we sit down with a character on Return to Amish and we say, hey, what have you been up to? What are you doing? Any interests that, have come up? And we had a character a couple seasons ago that said, yeah, I've always wanted to drive a car. I never got to drive a car. I'm Amish. I would love to try to drive a car. Bingo. We now have a storyline. So the storyline is going to be her getting her driver's license. And we really did take her through that process to get her driver's license. So we helped find her reality. A comment was made to me that has really stuck with me. One of the characters, again, on the same Amish show, she was a younger individual. And I said to her that question, do you have any dreams, or what do you want to become or do? How can we help facilitate those as part of the show? And she said to me, I don't even know how to dream. She's like, I've been Amish my whole life. I don't even know what those dreams are. I don't know what you all do or what the world does or what I could become. So talk about helping them find the reality. We had to teach her about the English world, the world outside of her Amish community, so she could just have dreams that we could then help facilitate throughout a reality show. We've helped individuals get their education. We've helped individuals travel to places they would never, ever, ever see. And all because we sit down at the beginning of a season and say, what do you want out of your life? And let's help you get that. And then that becomes a season of our show. So that's how it's really done.
And for me, I wish I did what you did, what you're doing. I absolutely wish I did. And many times I wish I was not a practitioner and I was not a litigator. I had a case in Lebanon County on Wednesday, one-day trial. And the entire trial, and I've spoken to opposing counsel, the entire trial centered around the dead man statute. And the Cliff Notes version is basically, if someone died, especially like in a contract dispute, I cannot present testimony that is against that person or in my interest against that person, because they're basically not there to defend themselves. And my entire case, it was a case where the decedent loaned my client money, and now the daughter, as beneficiary in the estate, she's suing my client because my client owes $17,000. And the debt, my client is saying the debt was forgiven. I spent weeks trying to come up with an exception, some way that I could win this case. And unlike you can take multiple shots of the same thing, and then you can edit it and get exactly what you want. I had one shot. And so it literally took me more than 100 hours. I went through every case, every statute, other cases, because when we try a case, we also have to prepare for an appeal. And we need to create a great record. I did all of this. And I get in court, and remember, this is my entire case. Okay? I get in court, and the daughter does not show up. On one side, you could say, you're great, you're golden. But what do I say? I have nothing to talk about, my entire case. And I'm thinking, I'm like, when my daughter was filming, they had like 12 seconds. And it took them at least 8 hours to film those 12 seconds. I didn't have any redo. I couldn't tell the judge, Your Honor, can we delay this for a day or two until I develop another theory? I had to wing it there and then. And so, you know, from my perspective, I get one shot. I get one shot, and it's great when you could prepare and prepare and prepare, but every now and again, you're going to prepare, and man, I was so ready for the dead man statue. and the last time I heard the dead man statue, it was during the Medmal case in 1996. You know, that's how far, so, and I had to wing it. There was no redo, there was no part two, there's no multiple angles from the camera, so it presents itself differently, but it's the same skill set. It's the same skill set that you do when you're filming a movie. There's the same skill set you do when you're going back into history and you're bringing out the things that certain individuals did in the past, and how do those experiences, how do they bear onto today and right now? And sometimes you just have to manipulate it to the best that you can with what limited facts you have, because it's almost never going to be given to you, as they say, on a platter where it's there for the picking.
Yeah, Nick?
Question about reality TV. I'm wondering, can reality TV change a culture in society? Have you seen it happen? Do you think it's possible?
Well, yeah, I do. In some ways, to stick to the example we've been talking about, there is an absolute thirst for knowledge about the Amish community now. We get calls every day about doing another series, different series, following this individual. The books that we've done have been New York Times bestsellers. So I do think here's a culture there was very limited knowledge about. You knew a few things from a movie here and there. You knew what the term shunning meant or something along those lines. But to get into experience their lives, they've not only changed their culture, because they now have to deal with the reality that we all know their culture, and they've changed us in that we now are exposed to this. One of the things that I think was dramatic change, now I certainly haven't done enough, but when on the show's success, we recognize that there would be many individuals that would just say, oh, these reality shows, and brush them off. So the book that we did, that we toured with, was a book that exposed not just the stereotypes that you know of Amish culture, but some of the stuff that's really bad and needs to change. The domestic violence, the animal cruelty. I can go through a whole list of them. But through that exposure, the book and the TV show, and talking to individuals that I know in the Amish community, we have started to change the culture a little bit. Not obviously, in its entirety. So I do think television, books, art has a way of getting attention and then hopefully inflicting that kind of change. That's what I hope. I hope that when people watch my series on Netflix about deaf individuals and get to see what their lives are really like, not just how they do sign language, but how they deal with the fact that they oftentimes grow up in families that won't bother to learn sign language. So every holiday, every family event, they're sitting isolated by themselves in the kitchen and completely unexposed to even their own family dynamic, which results in depression, anxiety, and suicide. So I do hope we change culture and that we have a better understanding and we offer help, advice, and guidance to those individuals. To me, that's the goal of the shows that we're making.
Yeah.
Just a follow-up question to that. Do you see, is there ever a conflict where you come across an issue about a culture and it might be very good entertainment, but is there any sort of discussion where you would say this might perpetuate a stereotype or maybe give a representative viewpoint that may not apply? Like, I mean, you're not an anthropologist or a sociologist or whatever, where you're saying, are we going to essentially typecast a culture in entertainment that might get very good ratings, but creates a perception in that wider TV audience that may not hold true?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's the perpetual challenge of the entertainment industry. My clients and myself we tend to want to put together shows that do not rely on stereotypes. You know, it's easy to rely on a stereotype and to try to get that drama and that sort of feed into what everyone already thinks. We try to go beyond that. That's the whole purpose of our show. But to your point, a lot of times we put together a show and we send it up to the network. And the network has their own set of lawyers in business and legal affairs. They have their own creatives. It goes through 10 different layers. And they will oftentimes say, we don't want to show that. We want to show more of this stereotype. We want to show less of this. And they ultimately do have the say. So sometimes, unfortunately, I watch a television show and I'm disappointed in how it ultimately comes out because of the final decision makers on the show. And they do oftentimes rely on stereotypes. They focus more on ratings than they do the educational component. And look, I get it, it's a business. At the end of the day, the entertainment is a business. It is a business. But at the same time, that we feel that's our job, is to keep pushing those boundaries and not rely on those cheap stereotypes, in my opinion.
I want to go back, if I can, Nick, to your question, because I think it wraps around sort of the intersection of, Todd, what you do, and in fact, more generally, what all of us do. You know, can a reality show, or in my example, can a lawyer change a culture, or in this example, change an individual through the creation of story? And I'm going to actually share a Derrick Henry story. And Derrick, please hit me if I start to, you know, go over confidentiality or attorney-client privilege or something, because I don't want to lose my life either. But anyway, so it goes back to this dynamic of Derrick Henry as a Randy Lee go-to guy. And I'll never forget, it's Thursday afternoon at 4:15, and I get a phone call. Hysterical person. I have a friend of a friend, and Children and Youth Services is having a hearing for them at 8:30 tomorrow morning. And they don't have an attorney, and Children and Youth Services is going to decide if they should begin proceedings to terminate these people's child parental rights, right? So it's 4:15 on Thursday. Hearing is at 8:30 Friday morning. And so what do? I call Derrick. And because I'm imposing on him, but I don't want to feel guilty about imposing on him, I say, Derrick, if you don't want to do this, you don't have to. I can always get somebody else. I'll never forget Derrick's response was, Randy, it is now 4:30 on Thursday afternoon. If I don't do this, who do you think you're going to get? And I'm like, I was hoping you wouldn't ask the question, right? So Derrick agrees to do it, and he goes, he you know, immediately, like, he kicks in, he meets the family, he sees the house, he goes through everything. He, you know, and there is disaster in these people's lives, right? There is dysfunction in these people's lives, right? He's their lawyer, they're his family, but there's dysfunction in the client, right? So he goes to the meeting the next day, finds out that the CYS person who's in charge of the case happens to see him every day when they both drop their kids off at the bus stop. So in case you were wondering, what is, you know, you have a duty to take your fair share of unpopular cases as a lawyer, right? That is not the Nazis walking through Skokie, which could be a very unpopular case, but that's what I always thought it was until I met Derrick. Unpopular case is you get it at 4:30 on Thursday, the hearing is at 9 on Friday, and you don't get to, it's a terrible case, and you don't get to do it in obscurity. You have to do it in front of somebody that you see at the bus stop every morning with your kid. That's an unpopular case, right? So Derrick's got this. Everybody in the room knows there's this dysfunctionality going on. But because Derrick is involved, they're like, okay, we can hold things up while you sort this out, right? So who does Derrick have to persuade? It's not Children and Youth. Where's the change got to come? An audience participation question, right? And we all know the answer. Who's got to change? Family. That's who he's got to persuade. And he's got to go back, and it's no different than when Todd was saying, we sit down with these people and, we help them sort of find their dream, find their story, right? And Derrick is like, okay, so what's our point B here? Our point B is we want to keep our kids. Okay, so here's our timetable. What is the story that you have to be able to tell, or that I have to be able to tell for you when we get to that point B? Let's figure out that story. Okay, so now that you and I understand this is a realistic story, you're right, this is the story we want to tell. How do we get to that story? Right? What are you going to have to change in your life so that we get to that story? Right? CYS is upset because you haven't worked in 2 years. Right? They're not requiring you to get a job. What are they requiring you to do? Apply. So what do I need to be able to do? I need to be able to go in and tell them that you're applying for 3 jobs a week, which means that you have to apply for 3 jobs a week. They want to see that the home is safe. What do you need to do to make that home safe? Right? And so he begins this process of helping the clients write the story. And it's not fiction, like Todd was talking about. What he's doing is not fiction, but he's helping these people to create this story of their life, this biography, this documentary that he can then show to CYS. And through this process of helping them realize what their story is and then getting them to live the story that they want to live, he gets to the point where CYS calls him one day and says, Derrick, we closed the file. Right? And I find it kind of sort of because all of these cases end like this, right? No. Okay, so Derrick won the lottery on this one. But the dad is, on the brink of walking his daughter down the aisle, right? Which would not have happened, right, if Derrick had not intervened many, many years ago and said, okay, let's figure out what the story is, and let's create that story. And that story, Dick, to go back to your question, the process of doing that changed a life. The process of doing that changed a culture, a family culture, right? And that's part of our job, to help the client find their story and then to help them figure out how to get to that story and actually make that story continue after the representation is over. Right? It doesn't end when the judge, leaves, but this is a story that you will continue to live out the rest of your life.
How much of that was because of who Derrick was, as opposed to Attorney A or Attorney B walking in the day of the hearing? How much of that was his reputation and what the court thought of him as an attorney to say, we'll give this family another chance?
Well, let me put the question back to you. And I will preface it by saying it's never...
Can I jump in for 1 minute?
Yes.
That was a great question.
Proceed. It's never about me, though.
Right.
It's never about me, because what I want to believe is that everyone in this room is capable of taking facts and manipulating facts in such a way to get a just and reasonable outcome. Okay, it's never my desire, my personal desire. It's never my hope or my will. It's what's in the best interest of these individuals and how do I go about getting it. And what I do, and when I tell people that anyone who I represent, I said, look, He said, you're seeing 6'5" black with a bad accent, but that's not what you're getting. You're getting a wealth of knowledge. You're getting superior analytical skills. You're getting someone who has the ability to go out and seek advice and counsel from others. So I become the quarterback, and I tell all my clients, I'm the quarterback, but there's an entire team behind me. And so what I bring to the table is a sum total of a lot of knowledge. You know, I'm not a family counselor, but I know I can speak to them that way. I'm not a recruiter, but I know I can speak to them that way. And when Todd is on a production set, you know, he sees so much. I'm going to go back to New Amsterdam, and there was a surgery. She's supposed to have some type of heart surgery, and they had a cardiologist on site. And after shooting it 4 or 5 times, he had enough. He said, you know what? I don't want to be paid. I'm just going to do the cut myself, and I'll do it properly, because he just needed it to be a certain way. And going back to your question, what we see is generally the sum total of a lot of knowledge that comes bearing on this. You see they do a reenactment of something at Gettysburg. It's not generally, it's more than just someone reading a book. Someone is going to go there and do costuming. Someone is going to go there and do weaponry. Someone is going there and doing linguistics. They bring so much to the table for production that you see it on television, and you see so few instances of misinformation. And I'm saying not from a political standpoint, misinformation in the sense that it's tight, it's thematic for the point in time. And so when we practice, that's what we do. We bring everything to bear, and it must be thematic for your clients. And it's a ton of research that goes into it. So I truly want to believe that Derrick is by no means unique. And anyone else in here who had those clients in that situation, they would have come up with a product that was very similar to mine to get the same outcome. So it's not Derrick.
I'd like to sort of explore this concept. My synapses just started firing. You probably couldn't hear them from back here. But when you made the comment, 6'5", black as a bat, accent, I'm not that, I'm this and that. I would argue that 6'5", black as a bat, accent plus, not instead of. And the reason that I say that, given, in light of the program today, right, diversity, how we expand our vista, right? How we expand our knowledge base, how we expand our perspective and our appreciation and respect for diverse cultures, right? As I say to my students, it's not the stuff, it's the other stuff, because presuming a certain level of capability or a higher level of capability, 100 lawyers walk into a room, they've got relatively the same amount of experience that the stuff, right? But the other stuff, right, means that what you bring, the other stuff that you bring, makes a person less reticent to hire someone who might look almost like you, who might speak almost like you. I might have a thing against tall lawyers, right? But now I see you, boom, I'm okay. I might have a thing about lawyers with an accent, but I hear you, boom, I'm okay. So I'm always curious about the other stuff and the impact that could have, not for your instant case, but for the case that resonates for others, after you. So I'm sort of curious about how you see your role as what others may see as the other stuff that essentially that is the essence of you when you're not the stuff. You see what I'm saying?
Sort of, kind of. And my response to that is the first thing that Randy said about me. I do not have an internet presence. I do not have an internet presence because when someone hears Derrick Henry, you know, it's not what you see on the internet. Okay? You get something that's unique, I think, is uniquely different from others. Okay? All my cases come from referral. No one has in this room has ever seen an ad for me. As a matter of fact, my clients, they say, but I can't find you on the internet. The only picture I can find of you on the internet is of you smoking a cigar from like 20 years ago. I'm like, oh my God, that's still up there? but no, and so I need to project something, okay? And that which I project, it's more than just me. I project us, okay? When a case is over, I want my clients to think of us in a good light because the profession is bigger than me. And if I leave with my clients saying, this attorney did well, attorneys do well, you know, it's great. What I do and what I love to do is medical malpractice. And every medical malpractice case that I have that turns out to be a successful case for me, the doctors love me to death. Because what I do is, boy, do I beat up on them for that one narrow instance. It could be a 2 or 3 hour SWAT of their professional life, and I will beat up on them for that. But I never beat up on them as professionals. I never belittle them as human beings. Okay? And I get them to understand that one act of malfeasance does not define them as a human being. And they walk away, and yes, they're hurt. Yes, they've caused them to end on the National Practitioners Data Bank for being sued. But they walk away still feeling good about themselves, still feeling good to walk into a hospital, a clinic the following day and practice and not feel bad about themselves. And I think that's what I bring to the table. I think it's a level of professionalism that I want for myself and I want for all of us because we all owe it to each other. As part of a minority group, be it pigmentation or be it profession, we owe it to each other to be good. And I think time is almost up, but when people ask me, what do I want for my kids? And I always say, I want my kids to be good neighbors. I say, what do you mean by that? Who's your neighbor? The neighbor is anyone next to you. Right now, it's Todd and Randy. It could be the person who's driving next to you. It could be someone who lives in the building next to you. You just have to be good to them and good people. And as professionals, that's what we should strive to be. We should strive to be good professionals. And I think 99+% of us, we do that. And we bring our history with us to be good. We get snippets of the history of others to be good. That's who we are. That's what I think I bring to the table on this side.
If I can just steal a kind of last couple thoughts before we close out. First of all, this is my last shot to thank people. So let me thank people. First people I want to thank is all of you for coming because this is an incredibly lonely experience if you're not here. It's so much more fun. So in fact, Vince, just so you know, Todd said that he wasn't speaking until you came. So things work. So thanks to all of you for coming, but there is still one more credit to be had. I want to thank Dean Johnson for his work and his support and his efforts to just promote both this forum and issues of diversity and inclusion in the law school. Student speakers who came in this morning to do the welcomes and have came into work today. Security people, maintenance people, Brian, Jeremy, Paula, Joy Boudreau, all had logistics responsibilities and did a wonderful job. While Derrick was talking, and again, Nick, thank you for the wonderful question, and Derrick's response to it, where he said none of it is about me, which of course is wrong, but it's right too, because as lawyers and as artists, and lawyers are artists, it is simultaneously not about us and all about us, right? It's about the art. It's about the client. It's about the life. And yet, Nick, as you point out, if we do not nurture our reputation, if we do not nurture our identity, if we do not nurture our skill set, then when the time comes to do the art, we can't do it, right? And it's very interesting. Your timing was perfect because I was so proud that I was able to make a slide. So yeah, for those of you who don't, I couldn't make a slide, but I made one, right? And it's a slide for Augusta Savage, and Augusta Savage, incredible visual artist during the Harlem Renaissance and beyond, right? And yet, we remember Augusta Savage as an artist, and yet she never considered herself primarily as an artist. She considered herself a teacher, right? That she would teach people, empower people to become artists. And her own art was just an opportunity for her to transfer those skills to those who would come after her. You know, and as she sought to encapsulate her career, I love this quote, "I have created nothing really beautiful, really lasting. But if I can inspire one of these youngsters to develop the talent I know they possess, then my monument will be in their work," right? And her work was in stone, it was in marble, it was in brass or bronze, whatever it was. Our work is in human lives, right? And the monument to our career will not be a building, because buildings erode and wash away. The monument to your career is what you do to the lives that you impact with that license. So as much as I would thank you for coming, which may seem kind of trivial, and it is in light of what it would really thank you for, thank you so much for what you do to be artists in the lives of others. And if we can take 7 minutes, come back, and then Professor Mack will enlighten us as well. All right, 7 minutes.
Elementary schools were segregated, even though that was contrary to the law in the state of Pennsylvania. It was hard to get a seat on a first-class train if you were black. It was hard to get a meal downtown. As a matter of fact, it was impossible to get a meal in the downtown cities, even in Pennsylvania. Sadie Alexander, for instance, a well-known black woman Philadelphia lawyer, when she was in college in the late 19-teens, went to the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and she would have to bring her lunch every day because there was no place in West Philadelphia that would serve a black woman lunch. So, very different era from today. But one thing about that era was somewhat different than what I've just described, and it was this thing. It was going to court. Courtrooms were different. In fact, I'm going to argue that courtrooms played a unique role as segregation began to be extended to northern cities like Harrisburg and Philadelphia. Courtrooms were places where boundaries were crossed. Because, in fact, the professional ethos of lawyers, the professional ethos of the legal profession, an aspirational ethos to be sure, was that there was only one kind of lawyer. There was not a segregated courtroom. There was not a black or a white courtroom. There was not a black or a white professional. There sort of was, but formally there isn't. Courtrooms were public space where everybody, if you were a lawyer and if you were allowed to practice law, was supposed to be treated like an equal. They were public space where blacks and whites both appeared in court, as in this photograph, in an era in which blacks and whites could not mix in any other public space. Even in the era of segregation, black lawyers appeared daily in courtrooms extending from Massachusetts to Mississippi. Lewis Redding, for instance, the first black lawyer in Delaware, said in 1929, quote, "I can honestly say that I've never encountered from any judge any overt display of racial prejudice," close quote. Even in Jackson, Mississippi, in 1930, a black lawyer said, quote, "Negro lawyers, of course, actually try cases here in court and almost daily. And white and colored lawyers work amicably together in the same case," close quote. Now, maybe that's a little bit of an overstatement, but there was something true about these kinds of statements. And the reason it was true was that things happened in court that didn't happen other places. For example, Raymond Pace Alexander, the leading black lawyer in Philadelphia, had a case in the middle of the 1940s, regular case. He was cross-examining a police detective in the Philadelphia Central Courts, which are in Philadelphia City Hall, and he browbeat the guy. Just, cross-examining him, just what lawyers do. He asked him question after question after question. The police detective, the white police detective, would answer, "Yes, sir, no, sir. They didn't find anything there, Mr. Alexander." And if you looked at this, it wouldn't seem remarkable unless you understood that 100 feet away, outside Philadelphia City Hall, Raymond Pace Alexander cannot be served a sandwich anywhere in downtown Philadelphia. He can't go to the movie theaters. He can't go to the opera house. He can't go to any of these things. But inside court, he got to do what no other black person got to do in that era, which was to address whites as equals. In a segregated world, right? What was race in a segregated world? One of the places where race was made, where we know who belongs in what category, is how you get treated when you go into public space. The noted scholar W.E.B. Du Bois, for instance, argued, quote, "I recognize black quite easily. The black man is a person who must ride Jim Crow in Georgia," right? So if you've got to ride Jim Crow in Georgia, then you're black. If you have to be segregated, you're black. But at the same time, it was true that most black lawyers practicing in most black lawyers practice in northern states, in cities like Chicago, Baltimore, Cleveland, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C., and New York. These were the same places where the barriers of race were hardening in the early 20th century. But courtrooms were different. There was only one kind of lawyer, formally at least, and every lawyer was supposed to be treated equally. That's why Alexander's story is so important, because it contrasts so sharply with what is going on in almost every other public space in a city like Philadelphia. Now, what we're talking about here, not to overstate what's going on in the courtroom. We're talking about formal equality. We're talking about a script, right? It's formal treatment, right? Forms of address, patterns of deference, professional acts dictated by the script, right? There's a script for a lawyer if you come into court, and everybody's supposed to follow the script. Everybody knows that someone like Alexander is supposed to be subordinate to the white lawyers the white people he's cross-examining in court. But they've got to follow the script. And they've got to treat and address him, at least for the most part. I mean, we don't want to over-exaggerate it, but for the most part, they have to address him just like an upper-class white person. And in a way that no other black person would be treated in any other public space in the city of Philadelphia. And perhaps the most striking example of this is, in fact, Thurgood Marshall. Now, Marshall, of course, is a name that would be familiar to everyone in this room. We know him as one of the greatest lawyers of the 20th century. We know him as the architect of the NAACP's school desegregation strategy. We know him as the architect of the Brown versus Board of Education litigation. We know him as the first Black Solicitor General of the United States, right? The person who argues the cases on behalf of the United States government in the Supreme Court. And we know him as the first Black Supreme Court Justice. Well, when Brown versus Board of Education, Thurgood Marshall's most famous case, reaches the Supreme Court, Marshall did something that provoked complaints from his fellow NAACP lawyers. He went out to lunch. He went out to lunch. He didn't just go out to lunch. He went out to lunch with this guy. His opponent in the case, the lawyer for the other side, a lawyer named John W. Davis, founder of a very famous law firm in New York called Davis, Polk, Wardwell. John W. Davis was perhaps the most prestigious lawyer in the country at the time. He also happened to be a Southerner and a devout believer in segregation. So why is Thurgood Marshall going to lunch with John W. Davis? In fact, Robert Carter, Marshall's principal deputy at the NAACP, pronounced himself kind of puzzled, dumbfounded, like, why is Marshall doing this? You're going to lunch with that guy? Not only did they go to lunch, but in fact, during the first and second arguments in Brown versus Board of Education, while the lawyers were arguing about the constitutionality of school segregation, while the lawyers are effectively arguing about the future of the United States, Marshall and Davis sat near one another in the courtroom and exchanged jokes and pleasantries in the back of the courtroom while the lawyers were arguing in the front. And Marshall did this in spite of Davis's private insistence on what he called the inherent, quote, anatomical and, quote, intellectual differences that constituted unmistakable signs that blacks and whites were supposed to be separate, Davis believed, in the public schools. So what's Marshall doing by going to lunch with this guy? Well, his assistant, Robert Carter, provided a hint. Carter recalled, in thinking through it years later, he said, quote, well, maybe Marshall, he asked Marshall about it, and Marshall said, well, we're both attorneys, we're civil, and it's very important to have a civil relationship with your opponent. What Marshall was really doing was playing with this thing that binds lawyers together. He's playing with the glue of professional identity that held courtroom lawyers together with regard to race. In any other instance, if a black person asks John W. Davis to go to lunch, he will not go. But he will go if it's his opposing lawyer in the lawsuit, even if the opposing lawyer is black. Marshall was making a point that the script that attached to his identity as a lawyer was a powerful way to make a segregationist white Southerner interact with him as an equal in public. Outside the courtroom process, of course, someone like Davis would never have interacted with Marshall in public. But the courtroom made everything different. In fact, Davis would pass away within a year of the Brown decision, dumbfounded that the court could have issued such a ruling, sure that his world was slipping from his grasp. But as Marshall knew, and as Davis apparently did not, the interactions between the black lawyer and the white lawyer in and out of court during the Brown litigation were as sure a sign of that slippage as anything else. And it helps explain the most puzzling feature of black lawyers in the early 20th century. Everybody knew, the puzzling feature of their lives, everybody knew that the legal system was rife with segregation, right? We're not going to sort of overstate it. But black lawyers, north, south, east, and west, say over and over again that, they treat us like equals in court. Do they really treat them like equals? Probably not really quite, but they say it over and over again. What they really mean by is that, at least compared to how they were treated everywhere else, the courtrooms are different. Their assertions about fairness in the legal system were in part based on how distinctive this was from how they were treated everywhere else. Early 20th century trials were often battles. They were battles, civil rights trials. They were battles over the script that should apply in the courtroom. In fact, black lawyers objected vehemently if white lawyers or judges departed from the expected forms of address. For instance, a Baltimore lawyer named Dallas Nichols he's somebody, we've never heard of Dallas Nichols. There's no reason we should ever hear of Dallas Nichols because he didn't really do a lot. It was really hard for him to practice law, never really challenged anything. He kind of just sort of did his thing for 20 years, took a bunch of little cases, and supported himself. But perhaps the only time, if you go through Dallas Nichols' records, the only time where you hear him object vehemently to anything is when he hears the white lawyer use the term darky in the courtroom. He writes the guy an angry letter, very uncharacteristic of Dallas Nichols, quote, saying, quote, "We are all human, entitled to courtesy and respect," right? The lawyer's done something. He's broken with the script, and Dallas Nichols has to break with his normal persona and adopt something more aggressive. And indeed, practically in the entire black bar all across the country erupted in outrage in the late 1930s when a Pennsylvania judge sentenced a black youth for attempted seduction of two white girls and said this, quote, "Had they been lynched, that would have been justified," close quote. The National Bar Association, the Black Lawyers Professional Group, which coordinated with the NAACP and lobbied the Pennsylvania legislature to impeach the judge. And that effort eventually forced the judge to make a public apology before the Pennsylvania legislature. So now, when of course I say, black lawyers, they reacted vehemently to departures from the script of the courtroom. And when I say that there was a script, I don't mean to sum up the image of something, unchanging, right? They're kind of making it up as they go along. The black lawyers show up, nobody really knows what they're going to do, and, they kind of sort of figure they sort of got to treat him like a lawyer. And there were reasons for this. Early 20th century legal communities were small, even in a place like Philadelphia. Relatively speaking, there weren't a lot of lawyers, and many of them tended to know one another. You'd meet somebody in litigation today, and you'd run into them 2 years from now. You'd run into them again 2 years from now. So, in fact, what happened is that black lawyers would face the same opponents over and over again. And over again, their opponents often became new allies. NAACP lawyer Charles Hurston, for instance, second from the left, it's going to be left, yes, left, second from the left in this picture. His first major civil rights case, for instance, involved a black man named George Crawford, who was accused of a double murder in Loudoun County, Virginia. Now, several things are noteworthy about Charles Hurston's first major trial. This is a picture of the trial team outside the courthouse. Right, so Charles Hurston goes into Virginia to defend a black man accused of killing two white women. One of the things that's notable about the trial was the unexpected degree of courtesy that both Hurston and his opponent showed toward one another, resulting in a conviction for George Crawford, his client, but not, as had been expected, a death sentence. And the other thing that was odd about Charles Hurston's first major civil rights case in Virginia was the repeated interactions between Hurston and the local authorities during the next decade and a half, because he comes to Loudoun County, Virginia in 1932 to defend George Crawford, and then he returns again and again and again. At least 3 times, Hurston returned to the county to defend everything, to represent clients in everything from an interracial rape prosecution to a school equality case. And when he returned, he often met the same personnel who he had encountered in the Crawford case, the same judge, the same opposing lawyer, and now they were often allies. For instance, in one case, the original trial judge in the George Crawford case helped Hurston. He helped Hurston by recommending clemency for a black man who had been accused of an interracial rape, in what eventually became a successful effort to free him and get him safely out of Virginia before he could be lynched. So Hurston would come back again and again and again to Loudoun County, and he would encounter the same lawyers and the same judges, and they would help him. Thurgood Marshall's approach, for instance, to his interaction with John W. Davis grew out of his early years in practice in Baltimore, where he likewise built up a professional relationship through repeat encounters with the same opponents over and over again in the courtrooms of rural Maryland. The young Marshall would write back approvingly to his superiors at the NAACP that he was, quote, given every courtesy, close quote, where he showed up for trial in some county where nobody had ever seen a black lawyer before. But they'd give him every courtesy. And he likewise built up professional relationships by repeat encounters with the same lawyers and the same judges over and over again in the courtrooms of rural Maryland. Over time, Marshall and his opponents, they kind of worked out a script, like how they're supposed to act when they come to court. Marshall would be given formal courtesy, given any other lawyer when he showed up in court, even in counties where, as I said, no one had ever seen a black lawyer before. In turn, Marshall's presence as a complete and equal member of the legal fraternity attested to the fairness or the unfairness of the proceedings before him. If Marshall pronounced the proceedings fair, then local authorities could prosecute black defendants in the most racially charged cases without fear of being charged with discrimination and without fear of unrest in the black community. But by the same token, Marshall said it was unfair. Marshall's presence sometimes enabled local authorities to come to verdicts that would otherwise seem unlikely given the racial realities of the time. For instance, he helped create a successful police brutality prosecution in a lawsuit by a black defendant in rural Maryland. So just by being in the court, right, he attests to the fairness or unfairness of the proceedings in front of him. And in Philadelphia, Raymond Pace Alexander's early law practice exhibited many of the same kinds of features: repeat opponents, a script, and his own presence in the courtroom as an attestation of the fairness or unfairness of the proceedings. In fact, black lawyers in the early 20th century imagined courtrooms as they were distinctive. They were places, as I said, where things happened that didn't happen elsewhere. But there was one exception. One exception to the courtroom being a distinct place for black lawyers, and the exception was civil rights cases. The civil rights courtroom, particularly in high-profile cases involving the NAACP, was the most prominent public space that remained off-limits to the crossing of racial boundaries of the kind I've just described. The nation's oldest civil rights law organization, the NAACP, preferred white lawyers for its most important work because, of course, they could get people like him. Clarence Darrow did cases for the NAACP. Black lawyers might handle the low-level work, the trial work, but if a case went on appeal, or if a case was really important, the NAACP expected white lawyers to take over. The NAACP actually often accused black lawyers of having an interest in major civil rights litigation. And indeed they did. Thurgood Marshall, for instance, later recalled, Charles Hurston, Thurgood Marshall's mentor, for instance, told his young protege Marshall, quote, "You can get all the NAACP work you want, but you've got to keep your eye out for cashing in." Civil rights lawyers were a way for black lawyers to make their reputations. They were a way for white lawyers to make their reputations as well, including this guy. High-profile cases. High-profile cases. So in that measure, black lawyers are no distinct not that distinct from their white counterparts, but they can't get into civil rights courtrooms because the common wisdom was that regardless of competence or interest, why would you send a black lawyer into a courtroom in a highly charged civil rights case when you could get a white lawyer, and of course, just because of race, the white lawyer would be more effective? Why would the NAACP ever send a black lawyer into the courtroom when you could get someone like him? And in fact, NAACP lawyers were largely right in that assumption. Most black lawyers existed at the margins of the legal profession. Raymond Pace Alexander is one of the best trial lawyers in Philadelphia by the early 1930s, but nobody knows it because almost no white people have heard of him. And many black people, if they can, will go out and hire a white lawyer. Charles Hurston, who I mentioned earlier, the NAACP's chief lawyer, at least before Marshall takes over, was one of the most academically accomplished white or black lawyers in the country. He was a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Amherst College. He was the first black editor of the Harvard Law Review. He returned and got his SJD degree, equivalent of a PhD in law, from Harvard. And he was the vice dean, effectively the head of Howard Law School. But still, most whites have never heard of him. They're at the margins. They really can't make their reputations, in part because they can't get into court in high-profile cases, and they can't get into court in really important civil rights cases. But something is happening. As I note, Clarence Darrow's, his dates are 1857 to 1938. Many of the white lawyers who initially did this kind of work for the NAACP were getting older, and many of them were beginning to pass away. It was time for the passing of the torch in the early 1930s. But what black lawyers needed was some kind of a high-profile case where they could make their reputations, where they could do in civil rights cases what they were able to do in the ordinary business of coming to court. And for Raymond Pace Alexander, that opportunity presented itself in early 1931. The opportunity to inject himself into the consciousness of white Philadelphians as well as blacks as one of the best trial lawyers in the city. The opportunity to bring himself to the attention of the NAACP so he could get civil rights cases. And the opportunity arose in the case in the context of a terrible, terrible crime. It seemed like almost the last case that Alexander would take, or that someone like Alexander would take, but he took it. The case involved this. It was a trial of a black youth named Willie Brown for the sexual assault and murder of a 7-year-old girl named Dorothy Lutz. In fact, after young Dorothy Lutz's body was discovered in early 1931, the Philadelphia newspapers called the ensuing search for the killer, quote, one of the greatest manhunts in the history of the city. There were no witnesses to the crime, but Willie Brown went missing. Like, he stayed out overnight. His family was concerned. They reported him to the police, missing. Can you go find our son? And the police find Brown. They take him into custody. And after 36 hours incommunicado, they produce a signed confession to the heinous crime. The upcoming trial was going to be a madhouse, not the place that a black lawyer would want to appear normally. The front pages of the Philadelphia tabloids had papers had tabloid-style coverage every day of this case. When Brown came to court for his arraignment, it took a half an hour for the police to clear out the angry crowd so he could be safely brought into the courtroom and safely brought back. And Brown's case was assigned to this guy, Judge Harry McDevitt. Harry McDevitt was a hanging judge. In his obituary, he was called, quote, the loyal champion of police against all complainers, close quote. If you were a criminal defendant in front of Harry McDevitt, you'd better pray. because you need some as much intervention as you can. The prosecutor in the trial, in Willie Brown's trial, happened to be this guy, Claire Finnerty, who later became a judge and a member of Congress. A young, ambitious lawyer, a young, ambitious Philadelphia district attorney who understands that the Willie Brown case can make his reputation. The public is howling for Willie Brown's blood, and if Finnerty can deliver, it will make his reputation. And it does, as you see. He's the Honorable Claire Finnerty. He becomes a judge because of this case. Very, very difficult case for someone like Raymond Pace Alexander to get involved. But for some reason that I still can't fathom, he decides to take the case on. But of course, there were reasons for Alexander to take the case on. He would have an unprecedented audience for a black lawyer, as I said, cases being covered by the white dailies like every day, over and over. It was being covered by black newspapers across the country, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Norfolk Journal and Guide, the Baltimore Afro-American, they all sort of cover it. And many black citizens, in fact, were appalled at the treatment that Willie Brown alleged had happened in order to obtain his confession. Brown said, or Brown's defenders said, that he was a scapegoat for an unsolved crime with no witnesses in an atmosphere where the police felt pressure to bring anybody, and particularly someone from a disfavored group, to trial for the murder. Brown alleged that he was beaten, starved, deprived of sleep, and threatened with a lynch mob for 36 hours before he confessed. So, for someone like Raymond Pace Alexander, Brown's case was an opportunity to perform before the white public who was reading about the case in the newspapers every day, but also an opportunity to make the case to African Americans in Philadelphia that a black lawyer could win in a case where no one thinks anyone can win. But still, Brown remained a tough case, and the results at trial seemed to validate the usual expectation that a black lawyer could not appear in court in a case of this manner. Whatever the advantage of the formal script of the courtroom gave to black lawyers in other circumstances, it didn't seem to appear in Willie Brown's trial. First, all the prospective black jurors were struck from the jury pool. I mean, there's no Batson versus Kentucky back then. You can just get up and strike all the black jurors. And Claire Finnerty, as the ambitious assistant district attorney he was, mobilizes images associate with lynching to obtain his conviction. The crime was horrific. The horrific nature of the crime, Willie Brown's confession, other circumstantial evidence that the prosecutor claimed linked Brown to the case. In fact, the newspaper said that Finnerty fairly screamed at the jury during his summation. And he said, quote, if one or two men would have been at the scene of this crime, we would never have this case here today. Saying, well, if there had been some men there, we would just lynch this guy rather than bring him to trial. Raymond Pace Alexander, by contrast, at trial, seemed to kind of lose his footing. He clashed angrily with Finnerty many, many times. The trial, in fact, was really no contest. Brown was found guilty and sentenced to death. But then, 8 months later, Finnerty and Alexander met again in the appellate court when Alexander came to argue Willie Brown's appeal before the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And it's hard to overemphasize how different the case was when it reopened 8 months later in the same building, in the chambers of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. The Pittsburgh Courier, for instance, reported that, quote, the utmost calm prevailed during the argument in Willie Brown's appeal. Alexander Alexander referred to Claire Finnerty. I mean, these guys sort of battled at trial. They kind of hated one another. Referred to Finnerty as my friend, and Finnerty referred to him as Mr. Alexander. Alexander pronounced Finnerty's trial tactics completely fair to the defense. He said, well, you know, he might have gone a little bit overboard, but, you know, he was sort of fair. His main complaint was Judge Harry McDevitt's charge, because in McDevitt's jury charge, he disparaged Alexander's theory of the case. He disparaged the evidence. He read the evidence in a certain way in front of the jury and encouraged them to discount exculpatory evidence. The news reports reported that the courtroom was crowded with lawyers. People were all around them because it's a big case. And at the end of the arguments, both lawyers warmly congratulated each other and were congratulated by members of the bar in attendance. And in fact, it was argued before this guy, Pennsylvania Supreme Court Judge George Maxey. And in fact, the courtroom display, the expressions of camaraderie, the courtroom script that Alexander and Finnerty followed, had an immediate effect on Maxey. In fact, Maxey later wrote Alexander, and he said, quote, "You addressed your argument to the Supreme Court with clarity and vigor and with fidelity to the prescriptions of good taste." So you followed the script. What's going on? Well, actually, the appellate proceedings, rather than the trial, were more indicative of the long-term trends in the relationships between lawyers across racial lines in relatively small communities, relatively small legal communities, even those of Philadelphia. It was the beginning of a process that would confirm Raymond Alexander's membership in a legal fraternity that crossed racial lines and, in fact, redefined the boundaries of race. If the most defining feature of the bar exhibited by the appeal was not racial division, but was, in fact, the connections between the two lawyers and between the two of them and Justice Maxey. In fact, there would be repeated interactions between all of these people in forthcoming years. Like, they all got to know one another. Take Justice Maxey, for instance. He and Alexander, this was not the first time they'd met. In fact, Alexander was the president of the National Bar Association, the Black Lawyers Professional Group, and he had been corresponding with Maxey for years before this case. He'd send them the proceedings of the Bar Association. Maxey would write a polite note back. Alexander had been building bonds with the white judges all over Philadelphia as in his career as a young lawyer. And Alexander knew his judge. George Maxey was a big fan of The Nation magazine. He read it regularly. He'd made The Nation's honor roll. He had dissented in a case upholding yellow dog contracts, which is a contract in which a worker signs an agreement not to join a union as a condition of employment. And The Nation had sort of named Maxey to its honor roll because of this, and Alexander sort of knew this. And after the trial, he began to exploit what he knew about Maxey. But first, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court issued its opinion in Willie Brown's case, and the opinion was written, as Alexander hoped, by Justice George Maxey. The court ruled that Judge McDevitt had overstepped his bounds by addressing the evidence in front of the jury. The trial result was overturned, and when it went back to the trial court, Brown eventually pleaded guilty to murder in exchange for a life sentence, which most people regarded as a victory under the circumstances. Well, in fact, the interactions between Alexander and Maxey would continue after the case. Because, after Maxey rules in Alexander's favor, Alexander sends notices to black newspapers all over the country. Yeah, we've just gotten this victory. Justice Maxey has overturned this conviction of this black defendant. Articles began to appear in black newspapers all over the country about the case. But the articles were, in fact, ghostwritten by Raymond Pace Alexander. He would just send the Norfolk Journal and Guide an article praising Judge Maxey for his learned opinion in the case. And the Journal would run the article. And then, when the articles would be published, Alexander would send the articles to Maxey. You're being praised in the press all over the place. Alexander wrote Maxey himself. He compared Maxey to the great liberal judges of the past, to Benjamin Cardozo, to Oliver Wendell Holmes, to Louis Brandeis. In fact, there was no accident there. Alexander knew his judge. These were Maxey's three great heroes at the bar. At first, Maxey responded to Alexander's letters just by saying, I just did I followed the dictates of judicial duty. Any judge would do this. Although he finally, in response to repeated entreaties and repeated mailings of ghostwritten articles, his distaste for the, quote, gross injustices, close quote, what he called, that African Americans were made to suffer under the law. And in fact, Maxey and Alexander would continue to interact. When Alexander wanted to become a member of the American Bar Association, which was whites only, it was George W. Maxey who sponsored his application. There was a relationship between the lawyer and the judge, a relationship mediated through the script of the lawyer's role of the court, which actually extends to black lawyers, that would allow Maxey to facilitate Alexander's career as time went on. In fact, the same thing happened with Claire Finnerty. Claire Finnerty, as I mentioned earlier, was an ambitious lawyer. He did become a local judge. And 10 years after this case, the same lawyer, Claire Finnerty, who used images of lynching to get Willie Brown's conviction, would be lauded by the NAACP as a champion of anti-lynching. And why would he be lauded? Because he ruled in Alexander's favor in one of the most important civil rights cases in the 1940s in Philadelphia. It was a case that involved a black defendant named Thomas Maddox, who had been arrested who was accused of a crime, in Elberton County, Georgia, and fled to Philadelphia for his safety because Maddox contended that if I remain in Georgia, I will be lynched. Authorities apprehend him in Pennsylvania, and the Georgia authorities petitioned for extradition. Well, under the law, as it existed at the time, there's very little discretion, right? If you claim that the Georgia proceedings will be unfair, you have to make that claim in Georgia. You can't fight extradition by claiming if they send me to Georgia, they're going to do something unfair to me. So Judge Finnerty basically has no discretion. He has to send the guy back, but of course he doesn't, because the lawyer who's in front of him is Raymond Pace Alexander. By this time, Alexander and Finnerty are friends. The case, I don't know exactly why Finnerty becomes the judge in this case. The different cases wind up with different judges, but Alexander got the judge he wanted. He wrote Finnerty during the case. Finnerty took a vacation at one point, and he writes Finnerty he said, I know you're going to go on vacation, Judge Finnerty, but make sure that no other judge takes the case while you're on vacation, which he did. And finally, Finnerty wrote an opinion stretching the law, deciding that he's not going to send Thomas Maddox back to Georgia, because everyone knows what's going to happen if you send Maddox back to Georgia, and releasing Maddox from custody. And when he needed to write an opinion justifying his action, he actually telephones Raymond Pace Alexander and said, Alexander, can you give me some pointers about how to write the opinion? Well, the standards for judge-lawyer interactions are a little different than they are now. By that time, they're friends, right? So his mortal opponent in the Willie Brown case has become his friend and has become his crucial ally in civil rights cases. And more or less the same thing happens with Judge Harry McDevitt. And in the interest of time, I won't go through it, but Alexander and McDevitt become friendly. Even though McDevitt, he's a hanging judge, he's not someone who a defense attorney is likely to become friends with, but Alexander would invite Judge McDevitt to address the local Black Bar Association. Judge McDevitt would come, they'd have a dinner, and over time, McDevitt would also become an ally in important civil rights cases. So in fact, Alexander's career and the careers of lawyers like Thurgood Marshall and Charles Hurston and other African-American lawyers in the civil rights era are a testament to the legal professional ties that bound lawyers together in an era in which racial difference was supposed to mark off blacks and whites from one another. So what can we learn from this? Well, one last slide. This is Alexander, so I should show you this last slide. This is Alexander in the late 1930s, and what you will notice is this is after one of his successful cases. It may not be obvious, but his client is white. So by the late 1930s, he's got the hardest thing to get for a black lawyer is that he has white clients. So how does this all happen? Because lawyers like Alexander and Thurgood Marshall and Charles Hurston, like figures in the Harlem Renaissance, are renegotiating the boundaries of race in the early 20th century, and they're using the courtroom to do it. They're doing it because they're lawyers. That something about being a lawyer and something about being in the court is different than racial interactions in other kinds of places. Something about being a lawyer binds them together across the deepest chasm of their era, which was the chasm of race. And indeed today, as we see ourselves drawn apart once again and divided, I think that the story of the African-American lawyers in the early 20th century reminds us that law is a tie that binds us together. Not for some technical purpose, not for some kind of undefined purpose of lawyering, but for the purpose that led Raymond Pace Alexander, George W. Maxey, Claire Finnerty, and even someone like Harry McDevitt to be bound together in the cause of social justice. So I should leave you there. Thanks very much, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Questions, if that'd be okay with Professor Mack?
How do you think civil rights lawyers are kind of shaped in today's times where I think people don't necessarily think that there's maybe not as great of a need for them, but how do you see how their role has evolved into the 21st century?
Well, I think that there are courtroom litigation. Courtroom litigation obviously isn't quite the tool it was in their era. But there are lawyers that try different kinds of strategies. So for instance, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, they've got this thing called the Thurgood Marshall Institute. It's basically just a think tank sitting inside a law firm. And they're basically thinking about what are the creative ways that lawyers can interact with communities, can mobilize them to build coalitions around things other than coming to court. So in this era, the thing that was distinctive, maybe the only avenue these lawyers had was to go to court to try to vindicate rights. But there are deeply, deeply creative lawyers that are thinking about differing ways. The lawyer who everyone cites nowadays, of course, is Bryan Stevenson. And he's done, there's the feature film about him that's out right now, which we should all see. I saw it about 2 weeks ago. He's a lawyer. He also created the museum in Alabama. There are all these ways in which lawyers are thinking about the struggle today as being different. Courtrooms being necessary, like Stevenson, he goes to court, he goes to the U.S. Supreme Court, he does all that stuff. And he's thinking about all kinds of other ways in which a lawyer might be of service to the cause of social justice. Sure.
So from watching the slide, it's clear that there are many things that especially black lawyers have to be kind of more grateful for because they didn't have to experience that. But is there anything that you feel is the biggest factor that kind of helped black lawyers better now in, let's say, 1965 until current day versus back then? Like, what would you say is like the biggest factor that really like makes things almost like statistically different as far as how they deal with you representing in the law profession?
I mean, I think the biggest factor is integration, but I want to say integration writ large, right? So if you thought about corporate law firms, the date that the first black lawyers, the first black partners in corporate law firms happens, it's almost always the same date. It's somewhere around like 1972. What really has happened between then and now is that the lawyers I'm talking about, they just had to practice in segregated spaces. If they could make themselves, if they could make connections to people outside those spaces, that was great, but their world was very circumscribed. I mean, the biggest asset of black lawyers today is the world that they created, that, you know, you can name almost, the word integrated, I'm going to use it in a very general term, but almost every part of the legal profession is integrated. Right? If there was not a black justice on the U.S. Supreme Court, it would be a problem. Black law firms that do, law firms that don't have women partners, minority partners, it's a problem, right? So in fact, integration has become an imperative. Integration in many ways is not, right? Like I'm from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. You know, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania is not integrated. But if you're an elite institution in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, there is pressure to integrate. If you do not have people of color as part of your institution, there's pressure on you to change. So I think that, you know, this kind of integrationist pressure, I think, is an asset that current day black lawyers have that people like this simply did not. Andy? Oh,
one more, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Please.
It's your show. Oh, okay. My chance to talk over the dean. I was wondering, how do you see the interplay between your work, your expertise as a historian, and your work expertise as a lawyer?
Yeah, you know, I think that they're complementary. Historians weigh evidence. They make arguments. Even, you know, like I present you with a narrative today, but the narrative is an argument, actually. I think much of the expertise, the techniques, they carry over. You're trying to persuade someone. I mean, I think a good work of history is a work of persuasion. It has to be objective, right? I mean, you have to stick with the facts, with the evidence, but you have an interpretation, and you're trying to convince people that it's true. So I sort of see the two things as being very complementary in there. Yeah, but maybe other historians would describe the writing of history differently than the way I do. But this is the way I describe the writing of history, and so I think that they're very complementary.